Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1, Silent Breach. I had never been late to work before. Not once in the 3 years I'd been at the office. But that Tuesday morning, I overslept. My phone's alarm didn't go off, probably because I forgot to plug it in the night before, and I woke up with the sun already high, the clock staring back at me, 8:17 a.m., when I was supposed to be at my desk by 8. I scrambled into my clothes, skipped breakfast, and dashed out the door. The streets were quieter than usual for a weekday, the usual hum of early commuters replaced by an odd stillness. I chalked it up to some road closures or early construction. I didn't have time to look. The bus stop was empty when I arrived, and the next bus wouldn't come for another 20 minutes. I decided to walk the 15 blocks instead. The morning was unremarkable. The air smelled like the usual mix of exhaust fumes and wet pavement from last night's rain. The sky, a dull gray, threatened rain again. I kept my head down, focused on putting one foot in front of the other, watching the ground for cracks and occasional puddles. About halfway there, I noticed a man standing on the corner ahead of me. He was dressed in a dark hoodie, the hood pulled tight over his head despite the mild weather. He didn't move or look at anything in particular, just stood facing the street, arms crossed. Something about the way he was positioned made me uneasy, but I told myself it was nothing, maybe someone waiting for a friend or a ride. I adjusted my backpack and quickened my pace, keeping my eyes on the sidewalk. When I passed the man, I caught a glimpse of his face. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with sharp features and pale skin that seemed oddly unhealthy, like he hadn't seen sunlight in days. His eyes darted quickly towards me, then away. My stomach tightened. I tried to shake off the feeling but found myself glancing over my shoulder. The man was still there on the corner, but now he was standing closer to the curb, looking in my direction. I couldn't tell if he was watching me or just happened to be facing that way. The unease persisted. I crossed the street and increased my pace, telling myself the office was just blocks away. I passed a coffee shop where the barista was wiping down the counter, and a few other pedestrians were scattered about, but no one looked particularly out of place. Yet, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Turning onto my street, I saw a group of 3 people gathered outside a rundown apartment building near the corner. They were talking quietly, faces obscured by the morning shadows. I recognized one of them, a man who worked in the mailroom at our building. He was known for being quiet, maybe a little odd, but harmless. As I walked past, one of the group glanced up and caught my eye. It was the mailroom guy. His expression was blank, but his eyes were sharp. The other 2 said something low and quick, and the mailroom guy nodded. I felt a chill run down my back. I didn't know what it meant, but I had the sudden urge to get inside my office as soon as possible. I stepped into the lobby of our building, the automatic doors closing behind me with a dull thud. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The place smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. Usually, by this time, the lobby was bustling with employees chatting, grabbing quick breakfasts, or fussing with their phones. But today, it was nearly empty. I approached the security desk. The guard, a middle-aged man named Roy, gave me a nod but didn't say anything. That was unusual. Roy was normally chatty, always ready with a joke or a comment about the weather. His eyes were tired, and he seemed distracted, glancing toward the elevators as if expecting something. I pressed the button for the elevator and waited. The reflective doors slid open with a soft whoosh. Inside, the space felt cramped and the air was thick with a faint, sour smell I couldn't place. The elevator was empty except for me, but as the doors started to close, I noticed a shadow flicker in the corner of my eye. I spun around, but there was no one there. When the elevator arrived on the 6th floor, I stepped out quickly. The hallway was brighter than the lobby, but the usual hum of computers and office chatter was absent. My desk was in the corner near the windows, and as I approached, I realized that no one else was around. I pulled out my phone to check the time, 8:45 a.m. A little late, but I thought I'd still make up for it. I sat down, powered on my computer, and waited for it to boot. The silence was deafening. Normally, there would be the clicking of keyboards, the low murmur of conversations, the occasional ringing of phones. Today, nothing. I tried calling my manager, but the call went straight to voicemail. I sent a few texts to coworkers, but none replied. The creeping sensation that had started on my walk now settled heavily in my chest. Something was wrong. I stood up and walked to the nearest window. From there, I could see the street below. A few cars passed by, but no pedestrians. The city felt deserted. Not in the sense of a citywide emergency or holiday, just eerily hollow. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Don't trust anyone. Not even those you think you know. My heart pounded. I reread the message several times, hoping it was some kind of mistake or prank. But the timing, the anonymity, it was deliberate. I locked my phone and put it in my pocket. I wanted to leave, but I wasn't sure where to go. The elevator doors were still open down the hall, but I sensed I wasn't alone on this floor. From the other end of the hallway, a soft, deliberate sound echoed. Footsteps. Slow, measured, deliberate. They stopped just around the corner, and for a moment, the silence pressed in on me. The hairs on my neck stood up as I pressed my back flat against the wall. No one came into view, but the steps started again, turning back the way they came, fading into the distance. I exhaled, trying to steady my shaking hands. Maybe it was someone else stuck on the floor, or someone heading out for coffee. Maybe it wasn't meant to unsettle me. I sat back down at my desk, the computer humming quietly in front of me. The phone remained silent now, but the message lingered in my mind like a shadow. Something had started. I just didn't know it yet. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind kept replaying the events of the day, the strange man on the corner, the empty streets, the mailroom guy's blank stare, Roy's distracted silence, that anonymous message. When I finally drifted off, it wasn't the kind of rest that makes the morning feel fresh, more like a brief pause in the middle of a storm. The next morning, I got up early. My body was stiff, and my throat was dry, but I forced myself to eat a small breakfast and dress for work. I wanted to go back, figure out if what I'd experienced was real or just my imagination running wild. On the way out the door, I checked my phone, no new messages. That in itself felt like a small relief. The streets looked more normal. People were out, walking dogs, heading to cafes. The bus stop was busy, and I noticed the usual rush of cars. The sky had cleared from the gray haze the day before. Part of me was glad, maybe it had just been a fluke, an odd day that would fade into nothing. But when I reached the corner where the man in the hoodie had been standing, the unease came back. The streetlight flickered overhead, and I caught the faint whiff of something burnt like a tire or a plastic bag smoldering nearby. No one else seemed to notice, but I pulled my jacket tighter and looked away. I arrived at the office building just before 8. The lobby was still quiet compared to usual, but there were more people than yesterday. Roy was at his post, but his eyes were sharper, less tired. He gave me a simple nod, no smile. I asked him if anything strange had happened yesterday, but he just shook his head. The elevator ride to the 6th floor was uneventful, but the sour smell lingered faintly in the air. I passed by a few coworkers on the way to my desk. They moved quickly, faces down, avoiding eye contact. No one greeted me. At my desk, my computer was already on, emails waiting. I noticed a new message from Hannah in accounting. It was brief. If you see anything odd, stay safe. We're watching. I frowned. Watching? By whom? And what exactly was going on? I typed back, asking for details, but the reply didn't come. Around mid-morning, a knock came at the door to the office suite. It was Mark, from IT. Normally, he was cheerful, but today his eyes were darting nervously. "Hey," he said quietly, "have you noticed anything weird around here? The network's been acting up, and some people have been locked out of their systems." I told him about the message I'd gotten, the empty floors, the strange man. He nodded, his jaw tight. "You're not the only one. A few of us have been talking. Something's definitely off." We agreed to keep an eye out for anything unusual. Mark left quickly, looking over his shoulder. By late afternoon, the office felt increasingly tense. People whispered behind closed doors and glanced anxiously towards the windows. I caught snippets of conversations, rumors about break-ins in the neighborhood, unexplained power outages in nearby buildings, even a few mentions of someone being followed. I tried calling my manager again. This time, the call connected briefly before cutting out. I heard her voice, low and hurried. "Don't trust the new security team, not safe." The line went dead. The words echoed in my mind as I sat frozen at my desk. The security team? I hadn't registered any new hires. Roy was still at the desk downstairs, but maybe there was more happening behind the scenes. The sun was starting to set when I decided to leave. Walking down the hallway, I noticed the flickering of the overhead lights was worse than usual. Shadows lengthened, and the hum of the building's air conditioning had slowed to an irregular pulse. Outside, the street was quieter again. The buzz of the city had dimmed, and the few people around moved quickly, heads down, like me. As I passed the rundown apartment building near the corner, I saw the same 3 people from yesterday. The mailroom guy was there again, but this time he was speaking low and urgent to the others. They stopped when they noticed me and quickly dispersed into the shadows. I felt eyes on me as I hurried away. When I got to my car, I found a small folded note tucked under the windshield wiper. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The message was typed, not handwritten. "Don't go home tonight. They're watching." The city lights flickered overhead as I sat behind the wheel, heart pounding. I debated calling someone, anyone, but my phone was dead. No signal. Probably from the power surges earlier. I locked the doors and sat there for a long moment, the night pressing in on all sides. The normal rhythms of everyday life felt shattered, replaced by something opaque and dangerous. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was happening, and whatever it was closing in. But for now, I stayed put, waiting for morning, hoping the daylight would bring clarity, if not safety. The house creaked under the weight of silence, shadows stretching like fingers along the walls. Every whisper of wind seemed to carry a warning, every flicker of the failing candle a pulse of dread. I clenched my fists, trying to will away the cold dread crawling up my spine. Morning couldn't come soon enough. The sun came up slowly, gray and hesitant, as if the day itself was reluctant to begin. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, staring out the window at the street below, which was quiet but not empty. People passed by with a wary gait, heads down, conversations muted. The usual morning noise, the honk of horns, the chatter of neighbors, was replaced by a low hum of uncertainty. I hadn't slept much, though I tried. My phone, still dead from last night's blackout, lay on the nightstand. I hadn't dared turn it on. The messages, the notes, the strange warnings, they were too much, and without answers, I was left with only questions. I knew I couldn't stay inside forever. I had to figure out what was going on. But the thought of walking out the door filled me with a cold knot of fear. I dressed carefully, choosing plain clothes, nothing attention-grabbing. I stuffed a small bag with water, snacks, and the pocket knife I kept in my desk drawer at work. Paranoia? Maybe. But I wasn't taking chances anymore. I stepped out onto the street just as the first commuters began to emerge, their faces tense and guarded. I noticed the mailroom guy almost immediately. He was standing a few feet away, leaning against a lamppost, smoking a cigarette even though it was early and no one else was. His eyes flicked toward me and quickly away. He didn't look like himself, more tired, more worn down, as if something was eating at him from the inside. I decided to approach him, hoping for some clarity or at least some human connection. "Hey," I said cautiously. "Can we talk?" He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "Not here. Too many ears." I nodded, following him around the corner into an alley between two buildings. The air was stale and smelled faintly of garbage and damp concrete. It felt like stepping into a different world. "You've noticed it too," he said without preamble. I swallowed hard. "Yeah. What is it? What's going on?" He glanced around, then lowered his voice further. "People are scared. Things have been happening, people disappearing, attacks, break-ins. Not all random. Someone's organizing it." "Who? Why?" My voice shook. He shrugged, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "That's the problem. We don't know. But whoever it is, they want control. Fear makes people compliant." I tried to process that. Control. Fear. It made sense in a way, the empty streets, the strange messages, the sudden silence in the office. "Have you told anyone else?" He shook his head. "Most people are too scared. Or they think it's conspiracy nonsense. But it's real." A sudden noise made us both jump. Footsteps, quick, deliberate, echoed from the far end of the alley. We looked toward the sound, but the passage was empty. "Come on," he said, urgency creeping into his voice. "We shouldn't be out here." We moved quickly back onto the main street, blending into the small crowd that was gathering near the corner coffee shop. It was quieter than usual, but not deserted like before. I asked, "What can we do?" He looked at me, eyes hardening. "Stay alert. Trust no one you don't know. Things are going to get worse before they get better." That was the moment I realized how fragile our world had become. The structures we took for granted, the safety of routine, the predictability of daily life, were crumbling. I thanked him, and we parted ways. Throughout the day, the office felt like a cage. People moved like shadows, avoiding eye contact, whispering in corners. The security team had changed in subtle ways. New faces had appeared at the desks, their manner clipped and watchful. Roy was gone. His absence was a cold bullet in my gut. At one point, I saw Mark from IT speaking quietly with one of the new security guards. The guard's expression was unreadable, but Mark looked grim. When our eyes met, he gave a slight nod, as if to say, "Keep your head down." I tried contacting Hannah again, but no response came. Late afternoon brought another blackout. The fluorescent lights flickered and died, plunging the office into darkness. The emergency generators kicked in with a low drone, but the hum was uneven, like a heartbeat skipping beats. People panicked quietly. Phones buzzed with messages I couldn't read. The sense of being watched intensified, a pressure on my skin, in my bones. I paced near the window, watching the street. A group had gathered near the rundown apartment building more than before. The mailroom guy was with them, speaking urgently. When he saw me watching, he gave a brief, sharp wave before disappearing inside. Then, a sound of a window breaking, sharp and sudden, shattered the uneasy silence. Heads snapped toward the noise. The crowd scattered like startled birds. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted. The office doors locked automatically. The new security guards moved swiftly, herding people away from the windows, telling us to stay put. A voice came over the intercom, cold and unfamiliar. Please remain calm. Security protocols are in effect. Stay inside and follow instructions. That was the first time I realized the situation had become a siege. Whatever was happening outside was no longer just background noise. It was here. The hours that followed were tense and disorienting. Power flickered. Conversations were hushed and fragmented. People shared rumors but no facts. I learned that there had been a string of robberies and assaults in the neighborhood, targeted, precise, focused on people who worked late shifts or lived alone. Someone near me whispered that a colleague's apartment had been broken into last night, the thief leaving a note, "Don't trust the locks." I shivered. When the building finally unlocked around midnight, the streets had changed again. The usual nightlife was gone, replaced by a thin crowd of wary faces, eyes darting, bodies tense for flight or fight. I walked home with a friend who lived nearby. We agreed to keep watch for each other, to stay connected. The city felt fragile, a glass sculpture at risk of shattering with the slightest touch. Back inside my apartment, I locked every door and window, double-checked the deadbolt, and placed the knife on the kitchen counter. The notes, the messages, the empty streets, they weren't isolated incidents anymore. They were warnings. Signs of a threat not supernatural, but human. Calculated, organized. I sat in the dark, flashlight in hand, waiting, listening as the city held its breath around me. Tomorrow would bring more answers or more danger. Either way, nothing would be the same. The next morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the smudged windows of my apartment. It wasn't the warm glow I wanted, it was pale, hesitant, like the day itself was uncertain about beginning. I'd barely slept. Every noise, the creak of pipes, the distant honk of a car, the occasional thump from the building, felt amplified, as if the silence had made my senses more raw. I stayed put for a while, sitting on the couch with my phone in my hands. The battery was stubbornly holding on at 30%, a small mercy after the previous days of dead screens and missed calls. No messages had come through overnight. No notes slipped under my door. Even the anonymous warnings had paused, or maybe the people sending them had learned to keep quieter. That alone was unsettling. I debated whether to go back to the office. The last days had been a mess, empty halls, strange faces, whispered warnings, and that growing, gnawing suspicion that someone was orchestrating the fear, the isolation, the slow unraveling of normal life. But staying inside felt like surrender, like letting the invisible enemy tighten its grip. Still, stepping outside meant facing who knows what. I needed answers. I decided to head out just after 9, aiming to get to the coffee shop near the corner, the one where I'd noticed the small gatherings, the mailroom guy's furtive meetings. Maybe there was a chance to gather information, or at least see how the neighborhood was holding up. The street was quieter than usual, but not empty. People moved quickly, heads down, eyes scanning around. The gray sky loomed overhead, hinting at rain. I noticed a few familiar faces, neighbors, a couple of store clerks who offered nothing more than nervous glances. None stopped to talk. No one smiled. That tight-lipped atmosphere felt heavier than any physical presence. As I approached the coffee shop, I spotted the mailroom guy standing just outside the entrance. He wasn't smoking this time but held his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his worn jacket. His face was pale, lines sharper than before, as if exhaustion had etched itself deeper into his skin. He glanced up as I neared. For a moment, I thought he might walk away, but then he gave me a small nod. "Are you going inside?" I asked. He hesitated, then nodded. I followed him inside. The space was small and dim, the kind of place that usually buzzed with quiet conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the clink of ceramic mugs. Today, it was subdued, almost too still, the few customers spread out in cautious isolation. We found 2 empty seats near the back, tucked away from the front windows. The mailroom guy leaned in, voice low. "Things are shifting," he said. "The group I told you about, they're organizing more now. Not just spreading warnings but trying to figure out who they can trust. Who's involved in this?" I swallowed, trying to keep calm. "Who do you think is behind it?" He shook his head. "No names yet. But it's not random. It's coordinated. Whoever it is has resources, money, people. They're using fear and uncertainty like weapons. And they're watching us." I nodded slowly. The pieces fit with what I'd been sensing, the strange new security guards, the sudden blackouts, the notes, the attacks. Someone wanted control. "Have you talked to anyone else?" "Outside the group?" "Only a few. People are scared, but scared people don't talk openly. They hide. They watch their backs. Some have stopped coming to work altogether." His eyes flicked toward the faded corner near the counter, where a young woman sipped her coffee alone. "Even here, there's no safety." We sat in uneasy silence. Then, a sudden noise broke through the low murmur of voices at the door, growing louder. 2 men entered, their jackets damp from the drizzle beginning outside. They scanned the room, eyes sharp, then paused briefly near the counter. Neither looked familiar. The mailroom guy stiffened. "They're here," he muttered. I followed his gaze as the men moved toward the window, standing in a way that blocked most of the view outside. The air shifted, the atmosphere thickened with quiet threat. I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. Pulling it out, I saw a message from an unknown number. "They're closer than you think. Don't trust the coffee shop." My heart hammered. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The mailroom guy's face tightened. "We can't stay," he said. We got up, heading for the door. As we stepped outside, the drizzle had turned to a steady rain, cold and sharp. The street was far quieter now, the few people around moving briskly, heads down. We walked together in silence, the sound of rain on pavement the only noise. I glanced at him. "Where to now?" He looked around before nodding toward the alley beside the coffee shop. "Safe houses. Places we trust. We can regroup there." I hesitated but followed. The alley was narrow and shadowed, the rain making the walls glisten with dampness. We moved quickly, careful to keep to the shadows. Inside the small building at the end of the alley, a group of people waited. Faces I recognized from the office, quiet, guarded, exhausted. They greeted the mailroom guy with nods and whispers. One of them stepped forward, a woman in her early 30s with sharp eyes and a businesslike manner. "Glad you made it," she said, looking at me. "We don't have much time." She explained that the new security team in the office building wasn't just security. They were enforcers for the group behind the attacks and intimidation, a private outfit hired to suppress dissent, to control movement, to instill fear. "We're trying to gather evidence, plan a way out," the woman said. "But it's only getting worse. They're increasing patrols, cutting communications. Power surges, dead zones, it's all deliberate. I looked around the room, taking in the faces worn thin by constant tension. Why me? I asked. The mailroom guy answered before she could. Because you noticed. You didn't look away. And now you're part of this. A weight settled on my shoulders. I hadn't wanted to be involved, but there was no turning back. Outside, the sound of sirens wailed faintly in the distance, mixing with the steady patter of rain. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of relief. I wasn't alone. But the fight was just beginning. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. The light on the screen was sharp against the dark room. For a moment, I hesitated, hands hovering above the device as if touching it might set something loose, something I couldn't control. Then I grabbed it and slid it open. A message from the woman at the safe house, meeting tomorrow morning. We need to plan the next steps. Don't tell anyone. Be careful. No time, no place, just that. I stared at it, the words blinking in the dim light. Then I pulled the curtains aside and looked out. The street was silent except for the occasional drip of rain from the eaves. The city was just waking up, but it felt like a slow, uneven pulse rather than a steady beat. I knew the meeting was necessary but hated the idea of moving through the city again, knowing eyes might be watching, waiting. I put on some clothes, the same way I had for the last few days, plain, unremarkable. Every detail mattered now. The wrong jacket, the wrong route, the wrong face could mean trouble. I left my apartment cautiously, checking over my shoulder as I locked the door. The hallway seemed narrower than usual, the shadows longer, even though it was broad daylight. I didn't see anyone, but the silence felt too deep, too complete. Outside, the street was still damp, the sky a heavy gray. A few people passed by, heads down, hands stuffed in pockets. I recognized none of them. There were no friendly faces, no brief conversations, no shared glances. It was like we were all actors in a play with no script, pretending nothing was wrong. I took the longer route to the meeting point, weaving through side streets and alleys, avoiding places I'd seen the new security team or their associates hanging around. I kept my phone off, pockets deep, eyes alert for anything out of place. The tension was a physical weight. Every footstep sounded too loud. Every passerby looked like a threat. When I turned a corner, I saw him, one of the men from the coffee shop 2 days ago. His jacket was soaked, his face unreadable beneath the hood pulled low. He paused, just for a second, and our eyes met. I looked away quickly and quickened my pace. That moment sent a jolt through me. I felt exposed, vulnerable. They were watching, just like the messages said. Not some distant threat, but here, close, breathing down my neck. I reached the corner where the group had arranged to meet. No signs, no names, no announcements. Just a nondescript doorway partially hidden behind a garbage bin and a flickering streetlight. I waited, heart pounding, the rain starting up again lightly. One by one, people appeared, the mailroom guy, the sharp-eyed woman, Mark from IT. Their faces were drawn tight with stress but relieved to see each other. No smiles, no small talk. We slipped inside, shutting the door behind us. The safe house was a cramped basement space beneath an old building. The air smelled of damp concrete and stale cigarette smoke. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows. There was a worn table in the center, scattered with maps, printed emails, and scribbled notes. The woman who had spoken to me before took charge immediately. We don't have much time. They're expanding patrols, and the windows are opening more often. We need to move quickly. She pointed to a map of the neighborhood. Red circles marked key locations, the office building, the coffee shop, some residential blocks. Our intel suggests the new security team has allies elsewhere, local gangs, corrupt officials. The attacks aren't random. They're targeted. We need to find out why. I ran my fingers over the map, noting the proximity of the marked areas. It wasn't just a local problem. This was a network of control, tightening like a noose. Mark spoke up next, his voice low but steady. We've been able to intercept some communications encrypted, but we're getting fragments. They mention a phase 2 starting soon. Whatever that means, it's coming fast. The mailroom guy looked grim. People are disappearing. Not just from work, but from homes. We've heard stories, neighbors vanishing overnight, calls going unanswered, families packing up and moving without explanation. Fear is spreading. The woman looked around the room. We can't rely on the police. They're compromised or scared. We need to gather evidence, document everything, and find a way to broadcast it. Get the word out before it's too late. I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. The last few days had been a blur of fear, confusion, and whispers. Now, this felt like a full-blown crisis. Do we have a safe place to send this stuff? To store it? I asked. There was a pause. Then the mailroom guy nodded. A few places, but they're risky. They're watching for unusual activity, unusual people. We have to be careful. The woman added, we're working on establishing a secure line of communication. For now, face-to-face is safest, but that won't last long. A sudden knock on the door made us all jump. We froze, listening. It was quick, deliberate, then gone. The mailroom guy moved to the door and peered outside through the peephole. No one there, he said, but his voice was tight, wary. The room tensed. The quiet outside felt like a held breath, awaiting. After a moment, the woman spoke. That's them. Testing. Trying to intimidate. We all sat back down, the tension coiling tighter. I looked around at the faces, people I barely knew a week ago, now my only allies in a city that was turning against itself. I felt the weight of it all pressing down, the fear, the dangers, the uncertainty. When the meeting finally broke up, we left in small groups, careful not to draw attention. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets wet and shining under the flickering streetlights. I took a different route home, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The thought that someone was following me was no longer paranoia, it was a fact I had to accept. Back in my apartment, I locked the door and slid the deadbolt home. I checked every window and double-checked the locks. The knife was where I left it, on the kitchen counter. I sat down, hands trembling slightly, and looked at my phone. The battery was low, but I powered it on briefly to check the time. No new messages. No warnings. Just silence. For a moment, relief washed over me. The quiet was a respite, a break from the constant tension. But it was fragile. I knew it wouldn't last. Outside, somewhere in the city, the watchers were still out there, waiting for the next move. And so was I. Story 2, Silent Footsteps Behind Locked Doors. I never thought much about the neighborhood where I grew up. It was the kind of place people passed through without much notice, rows of modest houses with trimmed lawns, children biking up and down the sidewalks, and the occasional dog barking in the distance. When I came back for the weekend after months away at college, it felt like nothing had changed. The same strip mall sat 2 blocks from my parents' house, the same corner store still had its peeling open sign hanging crookedly in the window. It was early Saturday evening when I arrived. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. I had just unpacked my bag in my old bedroom when my phone buzzed. It was a message from my old friend, Mark. We had drifted apart over the years, college, jobs, life pulling us in different directions, but he wanted to catch up. "Meet me at Pete's in 30, the text read. Pete's was this small bar tucked between a laundromat and a Chinese takeout place. Nothing fancy, but it was where we had spent a lot of time in high school. I agreed and told him I'd be there soon. I walked the familiar route, the air crisp with the first hints of fall, leaves rustling underfoot. The streets were almost empty, save for a few cars parked along the curb and a man walking his dog a couple of houses down. At Pete's, the usual neon sign flickered intermittently, giving the place a slightly run-down look that felt oddly comforting. Inside, Mark was already nursing a beer at the bar. He looked the same, tall, with that lopsided grin that used to get us into trouble. We exchanged greetings, slapping each other on the back like nothing had changed. As we talked about work, relationships, and the usual small talk, I noticed a man sitting alone in a booth near the back. He was middle-aged, wearing a dark jacket, and kept glancing toward the door every few minutes. At first, I thought maybe he was waiting for someone, but then I realized he hadn't moved or spoken the entire time I'd been there. His eyes didn't seem to rest on anything in particular. They just darted around with a nervous energy that made me uneasy. I mentioned it to Mark, but he brushed it off. "Probably some guy who just wants to be left alone," he said. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After a couple of hours, we left the bar. The night had grown colder, and the streets were even emptier. As we walked to our cars, I noticed the same man from the bar standing across the street, partially hidden in the shadows near a closed storefront. He wasn't moving, just watching. Mark joked about him being a stalker, but I felt the blood drain from my face. The man's eyes met mine for a split second before he turned and disappeared down the street. I told Mark I was going home, and he offered to drive me, but the car was parked several blocks away. I declined, wanting to get back inside and lock the door behind me. The walk felt longer than usual, every sound amplified, the crunch of leaves, distant sirens, a car door slamming shut. Halfway home, I caught a glimpse of the man again, standing under a street lamp, watching me. This time, he smiled, a small, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. My pace quickened. When I reached my front porch, I fumbled with my keys, hands trembling. Just as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I caught sight of a folded note tucked between the screen and the frame. I pulled it out and read the words, written in neat, precise handwriting, "Nice to see you again." My throat tightened. I didn't recognize the handwriting, and I had no idea who again was referring to. I double-checked every window and door, even the back porch. Everything was as it should be. I called Mark and told him what happened. He sounded concerned now, no longer dismissive. "Maybe you're just overthinking it," he said, but I could hear the tension in his voice. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, a prank, maybe. But as I lay in bed that night, the note resting on my nightstand, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me far longer than I realized. And that the quiet neighborhood where I grew up wasn't as harmless as I once believed. Sleep was elusive. Every creak of the old house seemed amplified, every shadow in the hallway stretching longer and darker than it should. I kept the note close, its jagged edges digging into my palm whenever I gripped it too tightly. The words replayed in my mind, a sick rhythm that refused to fade. Morning brought no relief. The sun filtered weakly through the curtains, the usual serenity of my childhood home now tainted. I decided to check the backyard, a place I hadn't visited since I moved back. The yard was overgrown, wild with untamed weeds and twisted branches clawing at the peeling fence. And there, half buried beneath the dirt and fallen leaves, was a small, rusted box. My heart hammered as I pried it open. Inside was a collection of photographs, grainy, distorted images of me, taken at different times over the past months. Some were recent, showing me asleep in my room or leaving for work. Others dated back years, including shots from my teenage days, always from a hidden vantage point. The realization sank in with icy certainty. This had been going on for far longer than I wanted to admit. I backed away, the metallic taste of fear rising in my throat. This wasn't just a prank or even a stalker. It was something far more personal, something that had burrowed into the fabric of my life, waiting patiently in the shadows. The neighborhood, the house, even the people I once trusted, all pieces of a darker puzzle that I was only beginning to understand. The box and its contents weighed on me like a stone. I kept it locked in the small safe my father had left in the closet years ago, unable to throw it away or even show it to anyone. Mark insisted I tell the police, but I hesitated. What could I say? I found creepy photos of myself buried in my backyard. Without any suspects, it would sound like paranoia, and I wasn't ready to admit that this was happening to me. That Saturday afternoon, I tried to get some sense of normalcy. I went to the kitchen to make coffee. My parents had stocked the cupboard with all my favorites, though it was strange to use their old stuff instead of my usual college brand mugs and machines. The quiet hum of the coffee maker was comforting, but even as I sipped, I felt the weight of ice pressing down on the back of my neck. I told myself I was imagining it. I decided to visit the corner store, mostly out of habit. The cracked neon sign in the window was still flickering, just like when I come back the night before. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. The air smelled of stale cigarettes and canned soup, familiar but stale. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Lang, an elderly woman who had owned the place forever. She nodded at me, her eyes sharp despite her age. "Back for the weekend, huh?" she asked in that dry, no-nonsense tone. "Yeah. Just for a couple days," I said, forcing a smile. She studied me for a second, then turned back to rearranging gum packets. "You look tired. Everything all right?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Just a long week." She didn't press further, but the way her eyes lingered on me felt like a quiet warning. Outside, the sun was low and the streets empty. I decided to take a different route home, one that cut through a narrow alley behind the strip mall. It was a shortcut I hadn't used since high school, overgrown and littered with trash. The air here felt heavier, the sound of distant traffic muffled by the buildings. Halfway through, I stopped. Something caught my eye, a small scrap of paper pinned beneath a loose brick in the alley wall. I crouched down and pulled it free. It was a torn piece of notebook paper with a scribbled message, "Don't trust the quiet." My heart pounded. I looked around, but no one was there. The only sound was the distant rumble of a car engine, fading as it turned the corner. I tucked the note into my jacket pocket and hurried the rest of the way home, every step echoing unnaturally loud in the narrow space. Later that evening, I sat on the porch with Mark. He'd come over after work, sensing I needed someone nearby. We drank cheap beer and tried to laugh about anything but what was happening. But even as we joked, I noticed the way his eyes kept drifting to the street, watching for something or someone. "Do you think it's someone from here?" I asked quietly. He shrugged. "Could be. Or maybe someone who's been around a long time, watching for the right moment." The idea made my skin crawl. I told him about the note from the alley. He frowned. "That's unsettling." We sat in silence, the street lamp casting a dull glow over the cracked sidewalk. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked, a sharp, urgent sound that made me jump. As night deepened, Mark left. I locked the door behind him and triple-checked every window. To distract myself, I tried to clean up the backyard, pulling weeds and tossing debris into a trash bag. It was exhausting, and the house felt colder, emptier with every passing hour. When I went back inside, I found another note slipped under the front door. This one was typed, The letters cut from a magazine and glued unevenly to a piece of cardboard. You're closer than you think. The message was crude but deliberate, and it hit me harder than the photos or the handwritten note. Someone was watching not just from a distance, but from somewhere very close, maybe even inside the neighborhood, maybe even inside the house. I called Mark again. "Did you hear that?" I asked, voice shaking. "Hear what?" There was another note. At the door. He was silent for a moment. "I think you need to stay somewhere else for a while. At least until we figure this out." But I wasn't ready to leave, not yet. This was my home, or at least it used to be. Still, I didn't sleep that night. Every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate. I pressed my ear to the floor, but they stopped. Dawn brought a fragile kind of peace. I opened the windows to let fresh air in and tried to convince myself it was a bad dream. But then my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You're not alone." I dropped the phone. My hands trembled. The neighborhood felt colder now, the familiar streets transforming into something I couldn't recognize. I realized then that whatever this was, it wasn't random or senseless. It was methodical. Someone had decided I was a target, and they were playing a game on my nerves, one where every quiet corner and shadow held a secret. I didn't know who or why, but I knew this wasn't going to stop anytime soon. For now, I was still here, still watching, still waiting. And something told me the real danger wasn't the notes or the photos or the stranger in the bar. It was what or who was lurking just beneath the surface of this quiet town, waiting for me to slip up. I had planned to leave town that morning just for a few days, enough to catch my breath and figure out my next move. But the moment I stepped outside, I realized it wasn't going to be that simple. The air felt thick, heavy, like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. I shoved my hands into my jacket pockets and scanned the street. Nothing. Just the usual scattered leaves and empty cars parked along the curb. But the silence was unnatural, oppressive. My phone buzzed before I reached the end of the block. Another message from the unknown number. "Look outside." I stopped dead. Look outside where? My chest tightened. I glanced back up the street, then down. Nothing unusual. The street lamp by the corner flickered, a stuttering rhythm that reminded me of the neon sign at Pete's. I swallowed hard and pulled my phone out, trying to steady my shaking hands. "Look outside where?" I texted back. No immediate response. I debated turning back inside, but a strange compulsion pushed me forward. I crossed the street and peered around the corner of the building beside my parents' house. There, on the front porch of the house 2 doors down, sat a single white envelope. Neatly placed, almost ceremonious in its stillness. I hesitated before stepping forward and picking it up. It was heavier than I expected, thick with folded papers inside. No return address. No name. Back inside, I locked the door behind me and sat at the kitchen table, the envelope resting in front of me like a loaded question. I tore it open carefully, unfolding a single sheet of paper and several photographs. The note was typed, the words stark and cold. "You don't know me, but I know you. I've been here a long time. Watching, waiting. You've missed the signs. You always do." My fingers trembled as I lifted the photos. They were different than the ones in the rusted box. These were recent, taken within the last week. The first showed my car parked outside Pete's that night Mark and I met. Another was of the alley where I found the torn note, this time with a shadowy figure barely visible near the trash bins. The last was a close-up of my front porch, taken in the early morning light. In the corner, a pair of boots was visible, standing just beyond the range of my porch light. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. How had they gotten so close? How had I not seen any of this? That afternoon, I told Mark everything. The photos, the notes, the message on my phone. His face darkened with concern, a look that went beyond friendly skepticism. He suggested I stay at his place, at least until we could figure out who was behind all of this. But when I tried to pack, I froze. Something about leaving the house felt like surrendering ground I wasn't ready to give up. I wasn't sure if it was courage, stubbornness, or sheer terror masquerading as resolve. So instead, I sat on the couch, phone in hand, scanning for any signs of a break in the pattern. Later, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I decided to check the backyard again. I needed to see if anything had changed since the last time. The gate creaked as I pushed it open, and the overgrown grass whispered against my legs. I moved slowly, eyes sharp for anything out of place. Near the fence, half hidden in the shadows, I spotted a fresh footprint pressed into the soft earth. It was large, the kind of boot someone might wear if they were trying to stay quiet but didn't care much about leaving evidence behind. My heart pounded. I crouched down, tracing the edge of the print with my finger. The soil was damp from the morning's rain, so the print was fresh. I backed away, the cold sweat prickling along my spine. Someone had been back here, someone who wasn't afraid to get close. The thought was suffocating. I locked the gate behind me and nearly stumbled back inside. My phone rang. It was Mark. "I'm on my way," he said. "I'm not going to let you handle this alone." I wanted to say no, to insist I could manage. But the truth was, I was too exhausted, too scared. I told him to come over. A few hours later, Mark arrived, carrying a flashlight and a worn baseball bat he'd grabbed from his trunk. The sight of him standing there, ready to help, calmed me, if only for a moment. We sat in the living room, doors locked, windows shut tight. The house felt smaller, more claustrophobic. We talked for a long time, piecing together what we knew. Whoever this was, they were methodical, patient. Someone local, someone who understood the rhythms of the neighborhood and the routines of my life. The notes, the photos, the messages, they weren't random acts of cruelty. They were calculated, designed to wear me down. Around midnight, we heard it, a faint scratching sound against the window by the kitchen. Mark and I froze, eyes wide. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. "Who the hell?" Mark whispered, grabbing the bat. We crept toward the kitchen, hearts pounding so loudly I was sure the intruder could hear. Pulling back the curtain, I expected to see shadow or movement. Instead, there was a single, dirty glove taped to the outside of the window, fingers splayed, as if reaching in. I tore it off, the sticky residue pulling at my skin. Inside the glove was a folded scrap of paper. We unfolded it together. The message was brief, typed in the same cold font as before: "Next time, I won't leave a gift." The implication was clear. Whoever was stalking me was escalating. The thought slammed into me like a punch, a promise of something worse to come. That night, I barely slept. Mark stayed on the couch, flashlight by his side. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows set my nerves on edge. But there was a tiny relief in having someone there, a person who refused to let me face this nightmare alone. By morning, I knew the game had changed. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore, it was about control. And I was running out of time to figure out who was pulling the strings. I looked out my bedroom window at the quiet street. The neighborhood that had once seemed so familiar now felt like a cage, every house a potential hiding place for the person who had invaded my life. I wondered how long they had been there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows. For now, I had Mark. And the knowledge that whatever was happening wasn't going to stop until they got what they wanted. But the question was, what did they want? And how far were they willing to go to get it? Mark left early that morning, promising he'd be back by evening. I watched him go through the window as he crossed the street to his car, bat in hand, eyes darting around, as if expecting to catch some movement I couldn't see. It was a small comfort, knowing I wasn't completely alone, but the hollow ache of solitude still settled in as soon as the door clicked shut behind him. I spent the day trying to keep busy, hoping to shove the gnawing anxiety to the back of my mind. I cleaned the kitchen thoroughly, wiped down surfaces, did laundry, anything to force some order into the chaos that had taken over my life. But no matter what I did, the feeling never left. It was like the walls were closing in, watching me as I moved through the house. The phone stayed silent. No new messages from the unknown number. No calls or texts from anyone else. It was almost unnerving, like the calm before a storm. Late in the afternoon, I headed to the local grocery store. The sky was gray, thick clouds gathering on the horizon, threatening rain, and the streets were unusually quiet. I kept my jacket zipped up and my head down, trying not to draw attention. Inside the store, I moved listlessly through the aisles, grabbing the essentials. I was halfway to the checkout when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I stopped and scanned the faces around me. There was a man near the dairy case, a few years older than me, wearing an ill-fitting coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. He was looking in my direction, but when our eyes met, he quickly looked away, pretending to check the expiration dates on a carton of milk. I instinctively took a step back and glanced around. No one else seemed concerned. It could have been paranoia, but the way his eyes flicked back to me every time he thought I wasn't looking made my stomach knot. I paid quickly and left the store, the man's gaze lingering on my retreating figure. Outside, the wind had picked up, and a fine drizzle had begun to fall. I pulled my jacket tighter and hurried home, the uneven sidewalk slick beneath my feet. The streetlights flickered on as I passed under them, casting long, wavering shadows that made the houses seem to lean toward me. When I reached my porch, I stopped for a moment and looked around. Nothing out of the ordinary. No one lurking in the shadows. But then, just as I was about to unlock the door, I noticed a small package tucked between the steps and the railing, something I hadn't seen before. My pulse quickened. I crouched down carefully and picked it up. It was a plain brown paper bag, sealed with a strip of tape. No markings, no name. I took it inside and locked the door behind me. Mark was still at work, so I was alone. I sat at the kitchen table and carefully opened the bag, half expecting something horrifying. Inside was a collection of items, a pair of worn gloves, a crumpled receipt from a nearby gas station dated just 2 days earlier, and a small notebook, the cover scuffed and stained. My fingers trembled as I flipped through the notebook. The pages were filled with neat, cramped handwriting, nothing threatening at first glance. But as I read, a slow, sick realization settled in. The journal was a detailed chronicle of my daily routines, when I left the house, what I wore, who I spoke to, even where I parked my car. There were sketches of my front porch, the alleyway behind the strip mall, and the backyard gate. Each entry was time-stamped, some as recent as yesterday. It was terrifyingly meticulous. I sat back, the notebook slipping from my hands onto the table. Whoever this was had been watching me for weeks, and they knew everything about me. The gloves made sense now. They were probably what the intruder wore to avoid leaving fingerprints. The receipt was a breadcrumb, proof that they were local, moving through the neighborhood with purpose. My phone buzzed. A text from the unknown number. You saw the package. Good. I swallowed hard and typed back slowly. What do you want from me? The reply was immediate. To be seen. To be heard. to remind you that you're not safe. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as the room seemed to tilt slightly. It was no longer just about fear or intimidation. This was a game to them. A malicious performance designed to break me down. I dialed Mark but went straight to voicemail. I left a terse message, telling him about the package and the notebook and to come home as soon as he could. I didn't want to be alone, but I was. Night came quickly, swallowing the sky in a deep, impenetrable black. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled damp and cold. I locked every door and window, drawing the curtains tight. Despite the precautions, I found myself checking the locks again and again. The notebook's pages haunted me, the precise observations of my life sinking deeper into my mind. Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed again. Another message, "Look outside now." My heart thundered in my chest. I didn't want to go near the windows, but I couldn't ignore it. I edged toward the living room window, peering through a small crack in the curtain. The street was empty except for the glint of a car parked at the far end of the block. In the driver's seat was the silhouette of a man. He sat perfectly still, facing my house. The headlights were off. I swallowed the lump in my throat and stepped back. I considered calling the police but hesitated. What could I say? That someone was sitting in a car watching me? Without a license plate or clear description, it would be dismissed. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening for any sound. The house creaked and groaned, but no footsteps came. Mark finally arrived just after dawn. His face was grim when I opened the door, and he didn't waste time. "We need to get out of here," he said, voice low and steady. "At least for a few days. Until we can figure out who this is and what they want." I wanted to protest, to say I wasn't ready to let this stranger win, but the exhaustion and fear weighed too heavily. I nodded. We packed quickly, taking only essentials and the notebook as evidence. As we stepped outside, I glanced back at the quiet street. The neighborhood looked peaceful in the pale morning light, but I knew better. Beneath that calm surface lurked something dark and patient. For now, I was safe, temporarily shielded by Mark's presence and the promise of distance. But the feeling lingered. This was far from over. Whoever had invaded my life was still out there, watching, waiting for the next move. And I wasn't sure if I would be ready. The motel room was dim and smelled faintly of mildew and stale cigarette smoke. The thin curtains barely blocked out the early morning light, and the threadbare carpet felt cold beneath my feet. Mark had insisted we leave the neighborhood that same dawn, the tension between us palpable as we packed the essentials. I hadn't argued. The exhaustion was too real, the fear too raw. But sitting here now, in this unfamiliar place, the reality of what was happening settled heavily over me. Mark was already in the bathroom, running water and muttering something under his breath. I stared at the small notebook, now dog-eared and stained with coffee where I dropped my cup last night. I flipped through the pages, each entry a reminder of the invasion of my privacy, the slow erosion of my sense of safety. The handwriting was tight and deliberate, meticulous down to the minute, the notes always ending with a brief description of something mundane, what I wore, who I talked to, sometimes even what I ate. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark stepped out of the bathroom, rubbing his face with a towel. "We wait. We try to figure out if there's any pattern, anything new we haven't seen yet." I nodded, but the feeling of helplessness gnawed at me. Even here, away from the neighborhood, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. The motel was quiet, almost too quiet, and every creak of the old building made me jump. I kept checking the locks on the door, even though I knew the thin latch wouldn't stop anyone determined. We spent the day in the small living area, cross-referencing the notebook entries with the messages I'd received. There was nothing new in the text since we left, no threats, No clues, just silence. But the knowledge that the stalker was still out there, somewhere, refused to let me rest. Mark suggested I call the police again, but I hesitated. The last time I tried, they'd been polite but dismissive. Without concrete evidence or a suspect, they said there wasn't much they could do. The photos and notes were unsettling, sure, but nothing was illegal on its own. The stalking laws required proof of intent or direct threats, and the messages, while chilling, were carefully crafted to avoid outright menace. Still, I couldn't just sit here waiting to see what would happen next. Later that afternoon, Mark went out to grab food. I stayed behind, pacing the room, my fingers twitching as I flipped the notebook open once more. The entries stopped 3 days before we left. No new notes, no recent observations. Did that mean the stalker knew we'd gone? Or were they waiting, watching from a distance? A sudden knock at the door made me jump. Heart pounding, I froze, then moved cautiously toward it. Mark's voice came from the other side. "It's me. I'm back." Relief flooded through me, and I opened the door to let him in. He carried 2 paper bags from a nearby sandwich shop and set them on the table. "Anything strange on the way here?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, nothing." The streets were empty, a few people walking dogs, but no one suspicious. I kept my eyes open, though. We ate in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on us. Afterward, Mark pulled out his phone and showed me something, a news alert about a break-in 2 blocks from the neighborhood, a house rifled through but nothing stolen. The homeowner had been away, so no one caught anything or saw the intruder. "That's close," I said flatly. "Maybe our guy," Mark said, voice low. "Trying to get in, maybe looking for something." The thought made my skin crawl. If the stalker was testing how far they could go, what else might they try? That night, I barely slept. The room felt smaller, the shadows longer. Every creak outside the thin walls sounded like footsteps. I kept my phone close, ready to call Mark or, if necessary, the police. Around 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed. I grabbed it instantly, the screen lighting up with a message from the unknown number. "Did you think you could hide?" My throat tightened. I typed back, hands trembling, "What do you want?" The reply came quickly, almost mocking in its brevity, "To remind you, you're never alone." I stared at the screen, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. The escalation was unmistakable. They knew where I was. They had followed me here. I showed Mark the message. His face went pale. "We need to move. Now." We packed in near silence, grabbing the essentials again. I tucked the notebook into my bag, its weight now more than just paper. It was evidence, a record of someone's obsession. We left the motel in the dark, stepping carefully through the parking lot. Mark kept glancing over his shoulder as we got into his car. The engine's hum was a comfort, the glow of the dashboard lights a small island of safety. As we drove away, I looked back at the motel's dull neon sign flickering against the night sky. Somewhere, someone was still watching, waiting. Mark took the back roads, avoiding the highway, murmuring about staying off the grid for a while. I didn't argue. I just held my phone, watching the unread message, feeling like the last thread of normalcy was slipping through my fingers. For now, we were safe. But the shadow trailing me was closer than ever. And I knew this nightmare was far from over. Story 3, Viral Dare, the last upload. The first time I noticed something was off, I was walking home from the grocery store. It was late afternoon, just a little after 5, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the row of gray apartment buildings that lined my street. I'd chosen to carry the heavier bags myself instead of using a cart, partly because I liked the exercise, partly because the store was only a few blocks away. The air was cool but not cold, and the faint smell of rain hung in the breeze. I remember thinking how normal everything felt, the way it always did on my way home. My building was a modest 3-story brick structure, nothing fancy. I lived on the second floor, in a small unit that barely fit a bed and a desk. I unlocked the door to the stairwell and started up, juggling my bags. That's when I caught movement from the corner of my eye, a man halfway down the hall, standing just inside the shadowed entrance of his apartment. I knew him by face, or at least I thought I did. His name was Mark, one of the few people in the building who ever acknowledged me. He was about my age, maybe a little older, always wearing the same worn-out jacket, a cigarette hanging from his lip, even indoors. When he saw me, he nodded briefly but didn't say hello. There was something about the way he looked at me, like he was studying me too carefully, that made me stop for a moment. I forced a smile and kept moving, my footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. The hallway smelled faintly of damp carpet and something else, something sour I couldn't place. I shrugged it off as the usual mustiness the building always had after a rain. That night, I locked my apartment door and settled in with a book. I was still thinking about Mark's stare, wondering if maybe I'd imagined it. I live alone, which sometimes feels like a blessing and other times a curse. I kept the blinds drawn even though I liked to watch the street from my window, but tonight there was an uneasy feeling that made me keep them shut tight. It was nothing, I told myself. Just the usual nerves. The next day, I went about my business, work, coffee with a friend, errands. I didn't see Mark, but I noticed the building's front door was propped open, which was unusual. Usually, the landlord keeps it locked except during business hours. When I asked the building manager, she shrugged and said the maintenance crew had been in earlier, fixing a leak in the basement. That explained the door, but when I walked past the basement entrance, I caught a flicker of movement behind the dirty glass window. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure looking out, but when I blinked, there was nothing there. That evening, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a short message, "We saw you." I stared at the screen, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was a prank or a misdial. But the timing felt too precise, the wording too deliberate. I immediately blocked the number and told myself not to dwell on it. Still, sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing the faint creak of the floorboards outside my apartment, the soft thump of footsteps in the hallway. At one point, I thought I heard voices, low and urgent, but when I cracked the door open, the hallway was empty. The next day was worse. Mark was back, this time sitting on the steps outside, staring down the street. He didn't acknowledge me when I passed, but I caught his gaze flicker toward me once or twice. Later, I found a scrap of paper slipped under my door. It had a series of numbers and letters, nothing obvious, like a code. I crumpled it up and threw it in the trash, but I couldn't stop wondering what it meant. A week passed like this, with little things accumulating, shadows in the windows when there should have been none, strange noises in the late hours, the feeling of being watched. I told a friend about it, but she dismissed it as paranoia. "You're just stressed," she said. Maybe she was right. I'd been working too much, sleeping too little. Then, one night, I returned home to find the front door of the building wide open again. The hallway smelled stronger this time, that sour odor mixed with something metallic. I hesitated near the entrance, bags still in hand. The staircase was dimly lit, and the faint scuffing sounds came from below, the basement. My heart was thudding so loud I thought it might echo off the walls. I called the landlord, who said she'd be there in 5 minutes. I waited, every minute stretching longer than the last. When she arrived, she frowned at the open door and the smell, then radioed the maintenance crew. They found nothing unusual, no signs of forced entry or trespassers. The building manager urged me not to worry, said maybe someone left the door open by accident. That made sense, but it didn't settle the pit of unease in my stomach. Later, standing by my window, I spotted Mark again, this time across the street, half hidden behind a tree. His expression was unreadable. When he saw me watching, he slipped away without a word. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that these odd moments were coincidences. But something inside me knew otherwise. The ordinary had started to unravel, thread by thread, and I had no idea what was waiting at the end. The next morning, I woke up with a dull headache and a lingering taste of metal in my mouth. I'd barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that sour smell from the hallway, imagined the shadows shifting just beyond the edges of my vision. The sunlight pushed through the cracks of the blinds, casting narrow bands of light across my bedspread, but the brightness felt intrusive, like it was exposing me. I tried to shake off the tension as I brewed coffee in the kitchen. The routine was familiar: grounding, grinding beans, the hiss of the machine, the smell of fresh coffee filling the small apartment. Still, when I glanced out the window toward the street, the usual quiet had been replaced by an odd stillness. No cars passed by, no neighbors hurried to work, just a faint breeze moving the leaves of a tree across the way. I grabbed my bag and headed out, deciding I needed to get out of the building altogether. The hallway was noticeably colder than usual, and the sour, metallic smell was stronger, almost searing, like rust left to rot in dampness. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and hurried down the stairs. When I reached the lobby, the front door was, thankfully, closed and locked. I stepped outside, breathing in the sharp morning air. There was no sign of Mark, but as I scanned the street, I spotted a faint smear on the pavement, like dried blood. It was small, maybe from a scraped knee or a cut finger, but it didn't belong there, not on this quiet street where no one ever seemed to get hurt. I crouched to look closer but didn't touch it. The pavement was cold and cracked beneath me. At work, I kept looking over my shoulder, though no one there gave me a second glance. My coworker, Tara, noticed I was distracted during a meeting. "You okay?" she asked, tilting her head. "Yeah, just tired," I said, forcing a smile. She didn't press further, but I could tell I looked on edge. After work, I stopped by the grocery store to pick up a few things. The automatic doors slid open with their usual hiss, and I stepped inside, trying to calm my racing thoughts. As I moved through the aisles, something caught my eye near the bakery, a small note pinned under a carton of eggs. I hesitated, then bent down and unfolded the crumpled piece of paper. It was messy, written in a hurried, uneven scrawl. "Don't trust a man upstairs." My heart skipped a beat. I looked around, but the store was busy with shoppers and employees, oblivious to my sudden tension. I pocketed the note and hurried to the checkout, my hands trembling slightly as I unloaded my items onto the conveyor belt. Back on the street, I tried to piece it all together. The note, Mark's strange behavior, the scent in the hallway. Who was the man upstairs? Was it Mark? Did someone else live above me I didn't know about? I'd always assumed the apartment above was empty. When I got home, the building felt colder still. The sour smell lingered in the hallway. I paused before unlocking my door, the note burning a hole in my pocket. My fingers fumbled with the keys, and when I finally slipped inside, the apartment felt too quiet, too empty. I closed the door behind me and locked it, then moved to the window. Across the street, I spotted Mark again, leaning against the wall of a closed storefront, cigarette glowing faintly in the dusk. His eyes found mine, and for a moment, an expression passed over his face, something close to regret, or maybe warning. Later that night, as I lay in bed, the silence was broken by the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my door. They were slow, deliberate. I froze, heart pounding, listening as the steps moved to the stairwell and then receded. The sour smell followed, seeping under the door like a bad omen. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? That someone was watching me, leaving cryptic notes, making my life feel like a bad dream? I didn't want to be the person who cried wolf. Instead, I checked the locks again. Every window and door sealed tight. The phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. We're closer than you think. This time, I didn't block it. I just sat in the dark, heart racing, waiting for whatever came next. The ordinary had begun to unravel, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold it together. The silence that followed was suffocating. Minutes slipped by, each one stretching longer than the last. Then, a soft creak echoed from the floor above, the kind of sound a house makes when settling, or maybe something else. My breath hitched. I gripped the edge of the armrest, every nerve on edge. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing, just the house's old bones. But the feeling of being watched gnawed at me, sharpened by the cryptic messages. I stood up slowly, phone clutched in my hand, and crept toward the staircase. The shadows there seemed to pull unnaturally, darker than they should be. A faint scrawl of movement caught my eye, a silhouette slipping behind the bedroom door at the top step. I froze. Should I call out? Run? My mind was a whirlwind, but my body refused to move. Another buzz on the phone. This time, a picture, my own front door, wide open, the lock hanging useless. My pulse thundered, the room suddenly feeling colder. They were inside. And they were waiting. The morning light slid in through the blinds in sharp lines, slicing across the floor like a warning. I woke up gasping, heart slamming against my ribs as if it wanted to break free. The phone lay on the bedside table, silent now, no new messages, no calls. I stared at it for a long time, half expecting the screen to light up again. But there was nothing. Just the faint hum of the city outside, unchanged and indifferent. It was nearly 8 when I finally got out of bed. My body ached from the restless night, every muscle tense, like I'd been bracing against some invisible force. I didn't want to look around, didn't want to see the door or the lock or the shadows, but I knew I had to. The ache in my gut wouldn't let me ignore it. I shuffled toward the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. No marks on the floor, no sign that anyone had been inside. The sour, metallic smell that had invaded the building in the past days was faint but still there, hanging in the stale air like a secret that refused to leave. I pulled the door open cautiously, checking the lock with a finger. It was secure, bolted tight. Relief was a sharp, bitter thing, temporary, fragile. I stepped into the hallway and it felt colder than before, not just physically but in a way that made my skin crawl. The sour smell seemed to grow stronger, seeping from the cracks in the walls or the floorboards. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the old building, but my eyes caught something near the stairwell, a scrap of paper, nearly hidden under the edge of the rug. I knelt slowly and picked it up, unfolding it carefully. It was another note. This one different, neater, but no less chilling. They're watching through your windows. I swallowed hard, the paper trembling in my hands. My eyes darted toward the windows at the end of the hallway, the same ones I'd avoided since the first night. The thought of someone peering in, just beyond the glass, watching without being seen, made my skin prickle. I shoved the note into my pocket, heart pounding. I grabbed my coat and headed out, anything to put distance between me and that building. The street was already starting to fill with people, kids waiting for the school bus, a pair of elderly neighbors chatting on the corner. Life moved on, oblivious. I walked briskly to the nearest cafe, hoping the bustle inside would drown out the gnawing unease. The barista greeted me with a tired smile as I ordered a black coffee. I found a seat near the window but kept my gaze low, avoiding eye contact with the other customers. My fingers drummed nervously on the table, and I tried to settle my thoughts. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was someone trying to scare me for some petty reason. But deep down, I knew better. After a while, I pulled out my phone and stared at the lock screen. No new messages, no calls. I debated texting Tara, maybe telling someone, but the words stuck in my throat. How do you explain something that sounds like paranoia? How do you ask for help without sounding crazy? I decided to try something else first. I called the landlord. Her voice was brisk but polite when she answered. Yes. Hi, it's me, the tenant in 2B. I wanted to ask about the maintenance crew that was in the basement last week. There was a pause. Why? I noticed the door was open again this morning. And there's that smell in the hallway. It's been getting worse. I see. I told them to check the basement thoroughly after the last visit. Nothing unusual came up, but I'll have them back tomorrow for another inspection. I hesitated. Did they find anything suspicious? Any signs of someone breaking in? No, she sounded firm, but I sensed an edge of annoyance. Look, the building is old. Sometimes these things happen, doors left open, weird smells. I'm doing my best to keep things safe. I thanked her and hung up. The usual reassurances felt hollow. Back outside, I walked without a destination, my mind tangled in worst-case scenarios. The note about watching through windows refused to leave me alone. I glanced around, catching sight of a man across the street, standing just inside a doorway. His jacket was dark, his posture stiff. For a moment, I thought it was Mark, but as I blinked, he disappeared. I quickened my pace, suddenly aware of the occasional glances from strangers, some curious, some uncertain. Maybe it was me imagining things, but sometimes those looks felt too pointed, too knowing. Later that day, I stopped by the grocery store again, partly out of habit, partly to distract myself. The place was crowded, the hum of voices and clatter of carts oddly comforting. As I moved through the aisles, my eyes caught a familiar sight pinned under a carton of milk, another note. This one was shorter. Don't trust your neighbors. I folded it carefully, slipping it into my pocket. The words echoed in my mind as I made my way to the checkout. On the walk home, the street seemed quieter, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows between buildings. I tried to focus on the mundane, kids playing, the dog walker calling commands, the distant sound of a siren, but the weight of those words pressed down harder. When I got back to the building, I hesitated at the entrance. The door was closed, but the sour smell was stronger than ever. It poured out when I cracked it open, hitting me like a wave. I covered my mouth and nose with my sleeve, stepping inside. The hallway was empty except for the fading light from the windows, and the faint flicker of movement caught my eye near the stairs. I turned sharply, but no one was there. My hands shook as I climbed to my floor. The notes, the smells, the shadows, they were closing in. I locked the door behind me and checked every window again, double and triple checking the locks. The apartment felt suffocating, the walls pressing in. I sat down, trying to steady my breathing, when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. We're inside the building. My fingers tightened around the phone until the knuckles turned white. The room seemed suddenly colder, the silence stretched taut, waiting. I didn't know what to do next. Then, from somewhere above, the floorboards creaked again. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing the hallway outside my door. I held my breath, every muscle frozen. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, fading into silence. For now. I didn't sleep that night. But I survived it. Whatever was coming, it wasn't going away. It was waiting, watching, closer than ever. And I had no choice but to face it. The morning after the footsteps faded, I woke up with a dry mouth and a pounding head. Darkness still clung to the corners of my room, though the clock said it was nearly 7. I lay still, listening for any sign that the nightmare hadn't ended, but all was quiet. The first few minutes felt like a reprieve, fragile and fleeting, but real enough that I almost believed relief was possible. I forced myself out of bed, each movement slow, my body weighted by exhaustion. As I went to the window and pulled aside the blinds, sunlight rushed in, flooding the room with an ordinary brightness that felt almost cruel. Outside, the street was waking up, the distant hum of traffic, voices, the occasional bark of a dog. Life was moving on, indifferent to the ripple of fear that had settled inside me. I stared down at the street, half expecting to see someone watching back. But there was no Mark leaning in the shadows, no strangers lurking behind trees. Just the familiar sights of the neighborhood, a mail carrier walking briskly, an old man wheeling a cart full of recyclables, a group of teenagers laughing as they crossed the street. Still, the sick feeling in my stomach stayed put. I had to get out of the apartment. The walls felt thinner today, as if they were closing in on me. I threw on my jacket and stepped into the hallway, the sour smell again, but weaker, almost like it was fading. I held my breath and moved quickly toward the stairwell. Halfway down, I stopped. A flicker of movement caught my eye near the basement door. I squinted in the dim light. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow retreating, but then there was nothing but the peeling paint and stained concrete walls. I shook my head and hurried outside. The street was quiet, calm even. I wandered without direction, my phone silent in my pocket. I thought about calling Tara, maybe telling her everything, hoping she'd understand. But the words never came. I wanted to believe it was over, or at least that I could handle it on my own. On the walk, I passed the bakery where I'd found the first note. The window was spotless, the display untouched by anything sinister. The city thrummed with normalcy. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the calm was just before a storm. I stopped at a bench near the park and sat down, pulling out the notes I'd collected. 3 so far: don't trust the man upstairs, they're watching through your windows, and don't trust your neighbors. I reread them, the meaning growing darker with each pass. Who were they? And why me? My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, footsteps behind me, slow and measured on the cracked sidewalk. I turned quickly, heart pounding again, but no one was there. Just the empty street and the fluttering leaves. I stood, decided to head back. When I reached the building, the door was closed. I paused, hand on the handle, listening. No sounds from inside. The sour smell was gone. I unlocked my door and slipped inside, locking it carefully behind me. The apartment was still, cold but safe. I sank onto the couch, phone in hand, and for the first time in days, I tried to breathe. Then my phone buzzed. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Another unknown number. A photo. This time, it wasn't my door. It was the exterior of the building, the front entrance, but the wide-angle shot showed a figure standing just outside, someone I couldn't clearly identify. The person's head was lowered, their hands shoved deep into the pockets of a dark jacket, but the posture was unmistakably tense, watching. I dropped the phone onto the couch and sat frozen. The message was simple below the image: "We're not alone." My phone buzzed again. Another text, this time just a single word. Tomorrow. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the window cracked open, the cool air filling the room. The silence was heavy, but it felt different. Less empty, more expectant. The ordinary had stretched taut, and something was about to break. I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. Whatever was coming, it was real. It was human. And it was watching. For the first time since this all began, I called Tara. I left a message, voice shaking but steady. I need help. The phone slipped from my hand as I waited for her call back. The silence answered. For now. The minutes dragged, thick and suffocating. My heartbeat was a frantic drum beneath my ribs, echoing louder than the quiet around me. Then, the sharp ring shattered the stillness. Tara's name flashed on the screen, impossible relief. I snatched the phone up, voice barely a whisper. Tara, it's happening again. I can feel it, right here. Her breath came through the line, steady but tense. Where are you? I'm on my way. I didn't wait to explain. I grabbed my coat, the weight of dread settling heavy as I stepped outside. The streetlights flickered, casting long, crooked shadows that seemed to twitch at the edges of my vision. Somewhere just beyond the reach of the light, something moved, silent, deliberate. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled every bone, that it wasn't just watching anymore. It was waiting. And this time, it wasn't alone. The air was unusually sharp that morning, the kind of cold that nips at exposed skin and makes your breath visible even indoors. I woke up to the sunlight bleeding through the blinds, painting lines across my ceiling. Tara had called twice overnight, leaving messages that I hadn't answered. Part of me wanted to call her back immediately, but the other part, maybe the bigger part, felt too exhausted, too worn down to talk. I stayed in bed longer than usual, listening to the distant hum of the city waking up, the faint sound of footsteps outside the building. When I finally forced myself out of bed, the apartment felt heavier than before. The walls seemed to press inward, the sour metallic smell faint but persistent in the corners. I went to the window and looked down at the street. A few cars passed, a couple of people walked their dogs, nothing out of the ordinary. No one stood lurking in shadows, no one watching. I wanted to believe the worst was behind me, that the calls, the notes, the messages, maybe they were from some sick prankster, or a coincidence blown out of proportion by my exhaustion and paranoia. But then I saw him. Mark, standing across the street near the corner store. His jacket was the same worn-out thing he always wore, the cigarette hanging loosely between his fingers. He didn't look up or acknowledge me, just stood there, shoulders hunched, staring at the cracked sidewalk. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Whatever his intentions, or whatever this was, it hadn't stopped. I pulled the blinds shut. The day passed in a fog. I tried to keep busy, to distract myself with work and errands. Tara had finally called back around noon, her voice tight but steady. "Do you want me to come over?" she asked. "I can leave now." "I'm not sure," I said. "Maybe later." She didn't press. We agreed to meet at a cafe near my apartment in the evening, someplace public where I'd feel safer. By late afternoon, the sun was low, the sky overcast with thick gray clouds. The sour smell was stronger in the hallway when I returned home, more pungent than it had been in days. I gagged slightly as I opened the door, the scent lingering like a bad memory. The building was quieter than usual. No voices, no footsteps. Just the dull hum of the street outside and the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. I locked the door behind me and checked every window and bolt again. My hands trembled slightly, but I forced myself to breathe. I reached into my pocket for the notes I'd been collecting, pulling them out one by one. "Don't trust the man upstairs. They're watching through your windows. Don't trust your neighbors. We're not alone. Tomorrow." The last one still echoed ominously in my mind, though tomorrow had come and gone without incident. Or so I thought. The moment I set the papers on the kitchen table, I heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps above me. Not the typical creaks of an old building settling, but measured, cautious steps, pacing back and forth. My heart stopped. I crept to the ceiling vent, straining to listen. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. I wasn't alone in my own building. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and sent Tara a simple text, "They're here." Seconds later, the doorbell rang. My blood ran cold. I didn't answer. The bell rang again, a sharp, urgent sound that echoed in the small space of my apartment. I debated calling out, but no words came. Instead, I moved silently to the peephole and looked out. There was no one there. Just the flicker of a shadow moving quickly out of sight. I backed away from the door, heart racing. Then the phone buzzed. Another unknown number. A new message, a photo. This time, it was the stairwell outside my door, empty, but the scuffed floorboards caught in the flash of the camera. Almost imperceptibly, a dark shape lurked just beyond the frame, half hidden by the staircase railing. I frowned, swallowing hard. The message below was chilling in its simplicity, waiting. I wanted to call the police, but what could I say? There was no forced entry, no direct threat other than these cryptic images and the unnerving signs that someone was inside my building, moving unseen. I sat down heavily, the phone trembling in my hands. The footsteps above began again, slow and deliberate, pacing the hall outside my apartment door. I held my breath. Minutes passed. Then silence. I didn't dare move. Eventually, I heard the faint sound of a door closing upstairs, the heavy thud of it locking. I waited another half hour before I dared to unlock my door and step into the hallway. The sour smell had intensified, sharp and metallic, drifting from behind the stairwell door leading to the basement. I peered toward it, my eyes catching the faint outline of someone slipping through the basement hatch. Panicked, I called Tara again. "I think someone's in the basement," I whispered, voice barely audible. "I'm going downstairs." "Don't," she said immediately. "Wait for me. I'm on my way." The minutes passed like hours before I heard the familiar sound of her footsteps in the hallway. When she arrived, she pushed past me, flashlight in hand, eyes sharp. Together, we moved cautiously toward the basement door. The stench was overwhelming now, a mix of mildew, rust, and something fouler, like decay. Tara fumbled with the lock and managed to open the door just enough to let us slip inside. The basement was dark, the beam from Tara's flashlight cutting through the shadows. We saw signs of recent activity, discarded cigarette butts, a half-empty bottle of cheap beer, fresh footprints in the dust. No one was there, but it was clear someone had been. We checked the rooms, the boiler area, the storage closets. Nothing. Just the stale air and the oppressive feeling of being watched. We climbed back up, locking the door behind us. "Do you think they're gone?" I asked, voice small. Tara shrugged. "They never really leave," she said quietly. We sat in my apartment for a long time, windows open to let in the cold night air. I felt a fragile sense of relief, knowing Tara was there, knowing I wasn't facing this alone. But the weight of the unknown pressed down harder than ever. Who was they? What did they want? And how long before the waiting became something worse? Outside, the street was quiet. But inside, the ordinary had shattered completely. And nothing would ever be the same. Story 4, Midnight Platform of Forgotten Souls. I had never thought much about the little cafe on the corner of Elm and 5th until the day I found myself there just after noon, killing time before a meeting. It was the sort of place I probably would have overlooked if I were in a hurry, a small brick building with peeling paint on the window frames, mismatched chairs pushed under tables that looked like they'd seen better days. The sign above the door, half faded, read Marco's, which gave it a tired, local feel. I liked that about it, though I usually preferred the chain spots downtown with their polished floors and reliable coffee. That afternoon, the light was soft, the kind that filtered through the thin curtains and made everything seem a little warmer, even when the air outside was crisp and sharp. I slid into a booth near the window, ordered a black coffee, and pulled out my phone to check the time. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a man sitting alone at the far end, hunched over a notebook, scribbling in a way that made his pen strokes sound sharp against the paper. He wore a dark jacket despite the mild temperature, and his hair was so close-cropped it could have been freshly buzzed. I caught his eye for a moment when I glanced up, but he looked away quickly, as if I'd startled him. That was the first thing that didn't sit right. I shrugged it off and took a sip of the coffee, which was surprisingly bitter, almost burned. The barista, a young woman with a nose ring and a tired smile, wiped down the counter with a rag that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in a while. I noticed a faint smell, something metallic and faintly sour, but I couldn't place it exactly. Maybe the old pipes or something else in the building. I pulled out my laptop to pass the time, but the Wi-Fi was spotty at best, disconnecting after every few minutes. A customer came in then, a man in his late 30s, wearing a wrinkled white shirt and carrying a briefcase. He paused by the door, glanced around, and then ordered a sandwich. I noticed the way he kept looking over his shoulder, almost compulsively. When he sat down, he placed his briefcase on the table but didn't open it. Instead, he just stared at it, tapping his fingers lightly on the surface. The cafe had one of those old analog clocks hung above the door, the kind with a faded face and hands that seemed to move a little slower than they should. It ticked loudly in the quiet, like a persistent reminder of time slipping away. I liked to watch the second-hand circle, almost hypnotic, but that day the ticking felt louder, more insistent, and it made me glance around the room again. The door jingled when a woman came in, pushing in a stroller. She looked flustered, checking her phone, talking to the baby with a soft, nervous voice. She ordered a latte and sat near the man with the briefcase, who barely acknowledged her presence. The baby started to cry, sharp and sudden, breaking the cafe's quiet. The woman tried to shush the baby, but it only got louder, piercing the calm with escalating shrieks. Then came a noise from the back, a thud, like something heavy falling. Everyone turned toward the kitchen doorway, where a middle-aged man in a khaki apron appeared. He looked distracted, his face pale and flushed as if he'd just run inside from the cold. He muttered something under his breath and disappeared again. The barista followed behind, carrying a small box, but there was no explanation. I glanced back at the man writing in the notebook. He had stopped mid-sentence and now just stared blankly ahead, his eyes unmoving. I wondered what he was writing so intently about, but the cafe had no Wi-Fi and no newspapers, so there was no obvious reason for such quiet focus. The woman with the stroller stood abruptly. She grabbed her coffee and the baby, still wailing, and left in a hurry, not even paying the man with the briefcase a glance. His tapping stopped at once, and he looked up as if startled by the sudden absence. Then the door jingled again, and two more people came in, a younger man and a woman, both dressed casually. They sat at the counter, speaking in low tones, but their conversation was laced with tension. The man's voice was clipped, almost harsh, and the woman's answers were brief, nodding more than speaking. It was the kind of energy that makes you look away, pretending not to listen but somehow catching every word. I tried to focus on my laptop again, but the battery was dying fast, and the screen dimmed annoyingly. I packed it away just as the briefcase man stood up, pulled out a small, worn notebook from inside, and flipped it open without looking around. He jotted something down, his handwriting neat and deliberate, then closed it again. The barista reappeared, this time with a phone pressed to her ear, whispering urgently. She glanced my way fleetingly, and I caught a hint of worry in her eyes. Then the cafe door opened one last time. A man in a dark hoodie stepped in, scanning the room quickly. His eyes locked on the briefcase man. He moved with purpose, but there was no smile, no greeting, just a cold, calculating look. The briefcase man's fingers trembled on the table, and he looked up, as though realizing he had been found. The tension in the air snapped, like a wire pulled too tight. But then, unexpectedly, the man in the hoodie turned on his heel and walked out without a word. The door shut behind him with a heavy thud, and the cafe seemed to breathe a collective sigh. The barista hung up the phone and wiped her hands on her apron. The man with the briefcase sat back down, exhaling deeply, and the young couple at the counter exchanged glances, their voices softer now. I gathered my things and left shortly afterwards, stepping out into the afternoon sunlight that had grown a little less warm than before. The ordinary world carried on, cars hummed by, pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the quiet cafe on Elm and Fifth was no longer just a place to grab a drink. It was something else entirely. Something watching, waiting, just beneath the surface. I didn't know it then, but that was the day things started to unravel, and the tangle of quiet menace lurking in ordinary corners began to pull me in. I didn't plan to go back to Marco's the next day. After yesterday, something about the place felt off, like it was a wound that had just been scabbed over but was still raw underneath. Still, I found myself walking down Elm Street after lunch, the way I sometimes do when I'm not thinking about anything in particular, just putting one foot in front of the other. It was almost a reflex. I told myself I just wanted to see if the cafe was any different in the daylight, or if maybe I'd been imagining the tension from the day before. The sign was still faded, the peeling paint on the window frames unchanged. When I pushed inside, the air smelled stale, like the thick residue of days past, with a faint hint of that metallic sourness I'd noticed before. The place was quieter than I'd expected, less populated, just one other customer, a woman sitting at a small table near the back, typing away on a tablet. The barista, the same young woman with the nose ring, was behind the counter, wiping down surfaces in slow, deliberate motions. She looked up when I entered, flashed a tired smile, and said, "Back again," as if more curious than surprised. I ordered the same black coffee and slid into that booth near the window. The sunlight was stronger now, direct, and it illuminated the dust motes floating lazily in the air. I pulled out my phone but held it loosely this time, watching instead the woman in the back. She had tightly pulled back hair, glasses with thick frames, and something in the way she chewed her lip made me wonder if she was nervous or just focused. Occasionally she glanced toward the door, then back to her screen. The tick-tock of the old analog clock drew my attention. The second hand was slightly behind where it should have been, as if the clock was running slow. For a moment I thought about asking the barista if it worked properly, but I didn't. The ticking was too persistent, too loud in the quiet room, like a metronome counting down. After a few minutes, the door jingled and a man came in. He was tall, maybe in his early 40s, with a scruffy beard and a long coat that looked like it hadn't been brushed off in days. He carried a worn leather satchel slung across his shoulder. He didn't order anything. Instead, he stood near the counter and started staring at the barista. Not in a casual way, but like he was memorizing her face, her movements, the way she wiped the counter, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. The barista caught his gaze, and for a moment her smile disappeared. She glanced nervously at the kitchen door, then back at him. He didn't move, just kept watching. The woman with the tablet looked up again, her eyes sharper now, almost wary. She packed up her things abruptly and left without a word, the quiet scrape of her chair on the floor ringing out. I tried to look away, not wanting to get involved, but the man's presence had shifted the atmosphere. The air in the cafe suddenly felt heavier, like the walls were closing in. I noticed the barista's hands trembling slightly as she busied herself with the coffee machine. Then, without warning, the man dropped his satchel on the floor with a loud thunk. He bent to pick it up, but in doing so, an envelope slipped from the bag and fluttered onto the floor. I leaned forward and caught a glimpse of the handwriting on it, neat, deliberate, addressed to someone named Marco. The barista noticed it too. Her eyes widened, and she quickly crossed the room to pick it up, clutching it tightly as if it were a lifeline. The man spoke then, his voice low and rough, asking if Marco was there. The barista's smile was gone now, replaced by something close to fear. "I'm Marco," she said quietly, and the man's expression softened, just a little, like he was relieved to hear the name. He asked her to sit down, which she hesitated over, but eventually did. They spoke in hushed tones, too low for me to catch more than the occasional word, deadline, payment, problem. The man's voice grew more agitated as the conversation progressed. I watched as Marco's fingers gripped the envelope tighter and tighter, her knuckles paling. The cafe door jingled again, and a woman stepped inside. She was older, around 50, with a sharp jawline and close-cropped gray hair. She went straight to the man with the satchel, placing a hand on his shoulder in a way that was both firm and warning. Their exchange was terse, and the man's agitation seemed to double. For a moment, their conversation was so heated I thought it might erupt into shouting. But the woman only shook her head and stepped back. Marco stood up, clutching the envelope to her chest, her voice barely audible as she said something I couldn't hear. The man in the satchel nodded grimly, then turned and left without looking back. The older woman stayed behind, taking a seat near the counter and watching Marco like a hawk. I stared, feeling my heart beating a little faster than usual. Something about the whole scene felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark, and none of it seemed accidental. The barista, Marco, caught my eye for just a moment. There was a flicker of recognition, but also a plea in her expression, as if she wanted me to leave, or maybe to stay silent. The clock ticked loudly above us, its slow second hand inching forward as if dragging time behind it. I gathered my things and left, stepping out into the sharp light of the afternoon again. The street felt normal, people walking dogs, cars idling at the light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was going on inside the cafe was getting worse. The quiet menace from the day before had taken shape, like a living thing pressing against the thin walls of Marco's. I didn't know it yet, but that afternoon was the point where the warning signs started piling up, and whatever was happening behind those chipped walls was about to spill out into the open. For now, though, Marco's remained just a cafe on the corner, waiting and watching, keeping its secrets close. Walking away, I caught sight of a scrap of paper caught in a puddle by the curb, just a small, torn corner. I bent down to pick it up. It was from an envelope, the same kind of neat handwriting scrawled across it. I stuffed it in my pocket and kept walking. Maybe I was getting pulled into something I didn't want to be part of. But at that moment, I couldn't stop myself from looking closer. I didn't mean to find myself back at Marco's that evening. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the street lamps to cast long, flickering shadows. I was supposed to meet a friend for dinner, but a vague unease kept pulling me toward the cafe. Maybe it was the scrap of paper I'd tucked in my pocket, a fragment of something I didn't understand but couldn't ignore. Or maybe it was curiosity, the kind that grips you when you know you shouldn't get involved but feel compelled anyway. The sign above the door was barely visible in the dim light, the faded letters blurring into the dark. I hesitated before pushing the door open. The familiar jingle sounded different at night, less welcoming, more like a warning. Inside, the cafe was almost empty. The soft hum of the old fridge behind the counter filled the silence. Marco was behind the counter, her face pale under the flickering fluorescent bulbs. She looked up as I entered and gave me the kind of tired, forced smile I'd come to recognize. Her eyes were wide, as if she'd been startled out of a nightmare. "Back again," she said quietly, wiping her hands on her apron. I nodded, but didn't say much. I wasn't sure what to say. The coffee machine hissed as she prepared a cup, but the usual comforting aroma was missing. Instead, the air smelled faintly metallic, like rust and cold sweat. I took a seat at the counter, close enough to watch but trying not to seem intrusive. The cafe's quiet was different from before, not peaceful, but tense, as if the walls were holding their breath. A man entered then, a stranger. He moved with the kind of casual confidence that immediately set me on edge. He was younger than the satchel man from the day before, maybe late 20s, clean-shaven, wearing a black bomber jacket that looked new, his jeans crisp and untorn. He didn't order anything, just stood by the door, scanning the room like he was sizing up everyone. Marco's hands trembled as she handed me the coffee. She glanced toward the man, then quickly looked away. I tried to distract myself by unfolding the scrap of paper from my pocket. It was a corner of an envelope, the same neat handwriting I'd seen before. The words were fragmented, but I could make out part of an address, a name, Marco's. The stranger moved toward the counter, his eyes never leaving Marco. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, and somehow colder than the autumn air outside. "Is Marco here?" he asked. She didn't answer right away, just swallowed hard and nodded. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "I have a message for her." Marco's gaze flicked briefly to me, a silent warning, before she took the envelope from the stranger's outstretched hand. Her fingers curled tightly around it, knuckles white. I felt the tension snap a little when Marco suddenly turned away, walking toward the back room. The stranger stayed near the door, eyes sharp and alert. I wanted to leave then, to step out into the cool night and forget whatever was happening inside. But something rooted me to the spot, the way Marco's shoulders stiffened as she disappeared behind the door, the stranger's unblinking watchfulness. Minutes passed, slow and heavy. Then the sound of a door opening and closing softly from the back. Marco emerged, clutching the envelope close to her chest. Her eyes looked haunted. The stranger moved toward her, voice rising slightly. She shook her head, voice low but insistent. I caught only a few words. "Not yet, too risky, we need more time." His expression darkened. He stepped closer, lowering his voice further. I couldn't hear what he said, but Marco's face twisted with anger and fear. They stood like that for a moment, close but not touching, the silence around them thick enough to suffocate. Then, unexpectedly, the stranger turned and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he glanced back at me, and I saw something in his eyes, a cold recognition, as if he knew I had been listening. The door shut behind him with a sharp click, leaving the cafe feeling empty and exposed. Marco sank onto a stool at the counter, her hands shaking as she unfolded the envelope. She pulled out a folded sheet of paper, stared at it a long time before letting out a breath that sounded like it came from her soul. I wanted to reach out, say something, but the words stuck in my throat. The weight of what I was witnessing pressed down on me, heavy and real. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a reminder that whatever game was playing out here wasn't going to wait. Suddenly, the cafe door jingled again. This time it was the older woman from the day before, the one with the sharp jawline and gray hair. She walked in with a purposeful stride, scanning the room quickly before settling her gaze on Marco. Her voice was low but firm. "You have to call him," she said. Marco's face crumpled in frustration. "I can't. Not yet." The older woman didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, black device, a burner phone. She set it on the counter between them. "Then use this. But you have to decide soon. They're not waiting." The words hung in the air, heavy and threatening. I felt a chill creep up my spine. This wasn't just about a cafe and a few angry customers anymore. There was something bigger, something dangerous. Marco looked up at me then, her eyes searching. For a moment, I thought she might ask for help or warn me to stay away. But all she did was shake her head slightly toward the door, an unspoken plea to keep quiet. I nodded, though my heart pounded in my chest. As I left the cafe, the night air felt colder than before. The street was nearly empty, the usual hum of city life muted under an uneasy quiet. I walked away without looking back, but the image of Marco sitting there, caught between fear and defiance, stayed with me. Whatever was unfolding behind the chipped walls of Marco's was no longer hidden. It was a quiet storm gathering strength, and I was caught in its path. For now, the tension had eased just enough to breathe, but I knew it wouldn't last. I was already too deep. I wasn't planning to go back to Marco's the next day, not after everything I'd seen and heard. But the cafe had lodged itself somewhere beneath my skin, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I told myself I was just going to pass by, maybe glance in through the window, and leave it at that. The sun was high, the kind of clear late morning light that made the weather seem ordinary, even friendly. The street was busy with people moving past, caught up in their own routines. It was the kind of day when nothing was supposed to be out of place. I stopped outside Marco's, half tempted to turn away, but ended up pushing the door open. The familiar jingle was quieter than I remembered, as if the bell itself was trying not to draw attention. Inside, the air was warmer than the morning outside but carried that stale metallic undertone again, faint but unmistakable. The barista was behind the counter, Marco, but something about her seemed changed. She was still pale, but today it wasn't just exhaustion in her eyes. There was something taut and brittle, like a wire stretched too far. She looked up when I walked in, but instead of the tired, wary smile from before, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You again," she said, voice low but not unkind. I nodded, hesitating. I wasn't sure what to say. It felt intrusive, like I was poking at something that wanted to stay buried. I ordered the usual black coffee and took a seat near the window. The sunlight spilled across the table, making the dark liquid in my cup glisten. I tried to focus on the steam curling up, on the quiet murmurs of the few other customers, but my eyes kept darting back to Marco. She moved with sharp, precise motions, wiping down the counter, arranging cups, but her hands trembled slightly. The faint metallic scent seemed stronger now, mixing with the faint smell of something worse, like something burned or decayed, just on the edge of recognition. The cafe was quieter than before. The regular ticking of the old analog clock hung in the background, steady and loud, but even it felt too loud for the space. It was like the sound of time counting down, slow and unforgiving. I watched the second hand drag itself forward, almost unwillingly. A man came in then. Not one I recognized from before, the briefcase man or the satchel man, but someone new. He was broad-shouldered and wore a dark jacket zipped up to his neck, sunglasses perched on his head despite the lack of sun indoors. He didn't order anything. Instead, he moved to a table near the back and sat facing the door, his posture rigid. He pulled a phone from his pocket and started scrolling, but every so often, he'd glance up, sharp and alert, like he was waiting for someone. Marco's eyes flicked to him once, then away. When she wiped her hands on her apron, I caught a glimpse of her knuckles, white from gripping the fabric. The tension in the room thickened, pressing down on everyone, even the few customers who seemed oblivious. The door jingled again. I looked up and saw the older woman with the sharp jawline and gray hair from the night before enter. She moved quickly to the front, scanning the cafe with a guarded, almost hostile look. Her eyes locked onto Marco immediately. The barista's posture stiffened, and she didn't speak as the older woman settled into the stool at the counter. Their conversation started quietly, voices low but urgent. I couldn't catch the words at first, just the tone, sharp, clipped, like a series of warnings. Marco kept glancing toward the back of the cafe and the man by the door. The older woman's eyes hardened, and when she spoke again, Marco's face tightened, her lips pressed thin. Then the man at the back suddenly stood. He slid his phone into his jacket pocket and moved toward the door slowly, but his eyes never left the interior. Outside, the street looked normal, people passing, cars humming by, but inside, something had shifted. The sense of waiting had stretched into something more dangerous, more immediate. Before leaving, the man looked back once, his gaze falling on me. It was a quick glance, cold and unreadable, but it made my skin crawl. Then he stepped outside and disappeared down the block. The door closed behind him with a decisive thud, and the older woman sighed, rubbing her temples. Margot's shoulders sagged, but she still didn't speak. The clock ticked on, louder now, as if protesting the sudden release of pressure. I wanted to say something, anything, but my voice caught in my throat. The older woman finally turned to me, her sharp eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, but there was a steel edge beneath the words. Not a threat, but a warning. "It's not safe." I nodded, knowing she was right. But I had questions I couldn't leave unanswered. "What's going on?" I asked quietly. She looked away, toward the dusty window, then back, her face hardening. "Trouble. Bigger than you realize. People who don't play fair. They watch. They wait. And if you get too close, well, sometimes it's better not to know." Margot cleared her throat behind the counter. "We have to keep going," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "No matter what." The older woman stood up then, slipping a folded piece of paper across the counter toward Margot. "This is the last chance. After this, there's no turning back." Margot took the paper, her hands still shaking, and glanced at me once more, a silent plea wrapped in exhaustion. I gathered my things slowly, heart hammering. The street outside seemed impossibly normal, almost cruel in its indifference. As I stepped back onto the sidewalk, the noise of the city rushed in, honking cars, distant laughter, the clatter of footsteps. Nothing in the world seemed to match the dark, taut secret held inside that small cafe. I didn't look back. But I knew the quiet was over. The ticking clock was no longer just a background sound. It was a countdown. Something was coming, and I was already caught in the middle of it. For now, there was a fragile calm, a temporary breath in the storm. But beneath it, the tension was coiled tighter than ever. And the next move, whatever it was, would change everything. I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window, the kind of persistent drizzle that blurred the edges of the street outside and made everything feel smaller, more isolated. The sky was a thick gray, pressing down, a dull weight that seemed to seep through the thin walls of my apartment. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, letting my mind drift back to Margot's, the cracked, tired cafe on Elm and Fifth that had somehow become this strange, heavy presence in my life. I hadn't been back since the last visit, though I thought about it constantly. The older woman's warning echoed in my head, people who watched, who waited, and the suggestion that getting too close came with consequences. I tried to push that down, tell myself it was none of my business, but I knew it wasn't true. It never was, once you peeked behind the curtain. The rain slowed by mid-morning, and I decided to walk over. The street was quieter than usual, the damp pavement dark and slick. The air smelled of wet concrete and something faintly bitter, coffee maybe, or the sharp tang of rust from the gutters. Margot's looked smaller somehow, its chipped paint darker under the overcast sky, the faded sign barely hanging on. Inside, the cafe was empty except for Margot, who stood behind the counter, her movements sharp but tired, like she was holding herself together with the last threads of will. She looked up when I came in, her expression flickering between surprise and guarded resignation. "You came back," she said, voice softer than before, almost a whisper. I shrugged, sliding into the booth near the window. The usual metallic scent was stronger now, mixed with something else, something faintly acrid, like burnt sugar or overheated metal. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried not to breathe deeply. "Things haven't gotten any easier," she said after a moment. "Not for any of us." I nodded, not sure what to say. The clock on the wall ticked steadily above us, its second hand moving with an almost mechanical precision, no longer dragging but sharp and cold. The door jingled softly, and two men walked in. They were new to me, both wearing nondescript jackets and baseball caps pulled low, faces half hidden. They moved with quiet purpose, eyes scanning the room before settling near the back. One pulled out a phone and began tapping on the screen. The other just stood, hands shoved into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the door. Marco's shoulders tensed, and she glanced over once as if weighing her options. I sensed there was no way to avoid this. The younger man at the back spoke quietly into his phone, the words just low enough to be mostly muffled but clipped, urgent. I caught a few fragments: delay, route change, no mistakes. The other man's eyes flicked toward the counter, narrowing as if trying to detect something invisible. I wanted to get up, to leave, but my body refused. I was trapped by the quiet weight of the scene, by the way the air prickled with silent threats. After a moment, Marco stepped out from behind the counter. Her face was pale, the exhaustion deepening the lines around her eyes. The two men looked up as she approached but didn't get to speak before the older woman appeared behind them, slipping quietly inside without announcement. She moved like a shadow, and the men straightened immediately. The older woman's voice was low and hard when she spoke. "Status?" The man holding the phone answered quickly, still waiting on the signal. "They've shifted things. We're holding for now." Marco's gaze flicked between them, her hands clenched at her sides. No one looked at me. I was invisible, or maybe just unwelcome. The clock ticked louder in the silence that followed, each second stretching thin. Then Marco spoke, voice brittle but clear. "I can't keep this up. If they push harder." "I don't know." The older woman's look was unreadable. "You don't get to choose." The man with the phone sighed and rubbed his eyes. "The deadline's tomorrow. After that, it's out of our control." I felt the words settle in the room like a fog. Deadline, control, whatever it all meant. The rain intensified outside, pattering against the windows like a slow drumbeat. Suddenly, the door opened again, this time with a briskness that pulled every head toward it. A man stepped inside, tall and lean, wearing a long coat that hung unevenly and a baseball cap pulled low. His eyes were sharp beneath the brim, scanning the cafe with a practiced wariness. He stopped in the center of the room, hands shoved deep into his pockets, and said nothing. The older woman and the men both stiffened. Marco's face went pale. There was a moment where the weight in the air seemed to stop, as if everything was holding its breath. Then the tall man's voice cut through the quiet. "Time's almost up." No one replied. He moved toward the counter, stopped in front of Marco, and pulled out an envelope. It was thick, heavy-looking, sealed with a dark strip of tape. Marco's fingers trembled as she took it, breaking the seal slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. She unfolded it carefully and scanned the contents. Her face tightened, eyes flickering across the words with growing dread. "I told you," she said, voice shaking. "They want it done tonight." The tall man nodded. "No exceptions." He turned and walked toward the door without another word. The others followed silently, leaving Marco alone behind the counter. I watched her shoulders slump as if the weight finally crushed her. The cafe felt impossibly quiet after they left. I wanted to ask her what was happening, what the deadline meant. I wanted to pull her out of this nightmare, or at least understand it. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood slowly and moved toward the door. Marco's voice stopped me just before I reached it. "You should go." Outside, the rain had slowed to a light sprinkle. The street was quiet, the usual hum of traffic absent. As I walked away, the envelope's image burned in my mind, along with the echo of the tall man's warning. There was no turning back now. Whatever was coming was closer than ever. The fragile calm had shattered, leaving only the raw edge of what was to come. I kept my head down and walked fast, the cold settling into my bones. The city around me went on, oblivious. But I knew the storm was gathering force, and I was standing in its path. Story 5, Frozen Profiles, When Screens Turn Sinister. I never thought much about the neighborhood until the day the streetlights started staying off. It was early October, and the days were already shrinking fast, but the block looked darker than usual when I left work that evening. My office was only a few blocks from home, an easy walk I usually enjoy to clear my head, but that night, as I stepped onto Maple Drive, the absence of light made the familiar feel wrong in a way I couldn't quite place. The first few streetlights flickered weakly and then died altogether halfway down the block. There was no warning, just a sudden plunge into shadow that swallowed the pavement and the parked cars. I slowed, squinting into the gloom where the familiar shapes of houses blurred into one another. The sound of my footsteps echoed oddly between the trees, and a chill ran down my spine. The air was still, too still, as if the neighborhood itself had been holding its breath. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and tried to ignore the urge to keep moving. Usually, I liked this part of the walk. The houses on Maple Drive were old, solid, full of memories I'd never been part of but had always felt connected to somehow. Tonight, though, the darkness made them seem like silent witnesses, watching me with unblinking eyes that didn't belong. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I fumbled it out, relieved to find a message from Lucy. Running late. Don't wait up. I tapped a quick reply and slipped the phone back inside. That message ought to have comforted me, but now, more than ever, I wished she was already home. As I walked on, the silence was broken only by a distant dog barking. It was a sharp, urgent sound, not a casual yip but a warning yelp, like something was wrong. The sound faded quickly, swallowed by the darkness and the rustling leaves. I wondered briefly who lived closest to the dog and whether they were home. Then I heard something else, footsteps. Not from behind me, but ahead, somewhere beyond the reach of the dying streetlights. They weren't slow or hesitant. They were deliberate, steady steps, keeping pace with my own. I stopped suddenly, holding my breath. The footsteps slowed, then paused. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it, but then a faint, low whistle cut through the silence. I glanced around, heart hammering. There was no one in sight, just the dark shapes of the houses and the occasional porch light blinking off in the distance. I restarted my walk, faster this time, telling myself it was probably someone jogging or someone coming home late, just like me. Still, the feeling of being followed prickled at the back of my neck. Reaching the corner, I spotted a figure leaning against the brick wall of a convenience store. He was wearing a hooded sweatshirt, pulled low over his face. He glanced up as I passed, revealing dark eyes that held me for a second longer than I wanted. I told myself not to look back, but the image stayed with me, silent, still, waiting. By the time I got to my own street, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The streetlights were working there, casting long pools of yellow light that seemed almost too bright after the blackout on Maple Drive. I unlocked my door quickly and stepped inside, locking it behind me without ceremony. Inside, the apartment felt cold and empty. Lucy's absence was a hollow ache in the quiet space. I made coffee, the routine soothing but unable to wash away the lingering shadows from my walk. The news was on a muted channel, a string of unrelated stories about traffic and local politics that did nothing to distract me. I checked the windows, locked and latched, then peeked through the blinds. The street outside was peaceful, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed except the wind, whispering softly against the glass. I was about to call Lucy when something caught my eye, a car parked across the street, its engine running, headlights off. The driver's window was down, and the faint glow of a phone screen illuminated the occupant's face. He looked up, and our eyes met briefly. Then he reached into the back seat and pulled out a baseball bat. I blinked, heart thudding. The man didn't smile, didn't wave, he just sat there, bat resting across his knees, watching. I stepped away from the window, grabbing the phone to dial Lucy's number, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a quick message, voice trembling slightly, telling her to come home as soon as she could. The car's engine purred on, the man unmoving. I called the non-emergency police line, my voice a little steadier now that I had a clear course of action. They told me officers would be dispatched to check the area. I sat down in the living room, the bat and the silent figure still burned into my mind. The timer on the coffee pot clicked off, and I poured a cup, hands still shaking. Outside, the man's car idled, waiting in the dark. Minutes later, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder. The man's head turned slowly toward the approaching blue and red lights. He started the car and pulled away just as the police car turned onto the street. I exhaled, a shaky laugh escaping me. The officers arrived moments later, asking a few questions, taking notes. They said they'd patrol the area for a while. I thanked them, promising to call if anything else happened. After they left, the neighborhood felt quieter, less menacing. But as I closed the blinds and turned off the living room light, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness hadn't gone away, it had just moved somewhere else, waiting. The next day was a study in normalcy, which only made the shadows from the night before feel heavier when evening rolled around. I went through my morning routine with mechanical precision, coffee, shower, breakfast, while my mind kept drifting back to the man in the car. His bat, the way he didn't flinch at the police, the way he just sat there like he was waiting for something. I told myself it was probably just some local weirdo, nothing new in a neighborhood like this. But the pit in my stomach didn't budge. Work was a distraction, but not a good one. My office was only a few blocks from home, and there was no way I could walk back through Maple Drive again today. So I convinced myself to call a cab after work, pretending it was just a matter of convenience. The driver was quiet, the kind of polite but distant man who doesn't ask questions and doesn't volunteer conversation. I found myself watching the houses go by, noticing the way the streetlights flickered on as dusk bled into night. The blackout on Maple Drive was still in effect. The city maintenance team had apparently been called, but no one knew when the lights would be fixed. I thought about that as I stared out the window, feeling small and exposed. I wondered if the man from last night was still around, lurking in the dark edges of the neighborhood. When the cab dropped me off 2 blocks from my apartment, I took a longer route home, weaving through lit streets and well-trafficked sidewalks. I told myself it was safer. I told myself it was just paranoia. But when I passed the convenience store where I'd seen him standing, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up again. The store was closed, its windows dark and empty. No sign of him. That night, I left the apartment door unlocked for the first time in years, I think. Lucy was still not home, and I needed the option to leave quickly if I had to. The streetlights on my block flickered unevenly, casting irregular shadows that made me jump every time a tree branch scraped against a window. I kept the blinds slightly open, watching the street, waiting for anything unusual. Hours passed. My phone buzzed with a message from Lucy, almost there. Sorry, traffic was a nightmare. Relief washed over me in a wave so strong it almost knocked the breath out of my lungs. I locked the door properly for the second time that night and paced the living room, stretching my legs and trying to shake the lingering tension. Then the knocking started. It was soft at first, polite in its persistence. I froze, heart thudding, hands clammy. The knock wasn't hurried or angry, just deliberate, precise, like someone tapping a code against the door. I glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m. Who would be knocking this late? I wasn't expecting anyone. I edged toward the door, peering through the peephole. Nothing but blackness. No figure, no silhouette. Just the dark street, empty and silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. The knock came again, 3 sharp raps this time. I backed away, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it someone trying to get in? A prankster? Or worse, the man from last night? I considered calling the police again, but what would I say? Someone knocked on my door 3 times, but I can't see them. I swallowed hard and locked the door, sliding the deadbolt into place. The knocking stopped. I sat on the couch, hands shaking, trying to calm down. The silence in the apartment was thick and suffocating, almost louder than the knocking. My phone buzzed again. Lucy's arrival message this time. Here, finally. I grabbed my keys and went downstairs to meet her. In the stairwell, I saw him. Not the man from the car, but another figure, lean and shadowy, standing just beyond the stairwell's last landing. His face was obscured by a hood, but I recognized the slow, deliberate way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Something about the way he watched me sent a jolt through my body. I ignored him, hurried outside, and locked the door behind me. Lucy was there, and I felt a flicker of safety in her presence. I told her about the knocking, about the man in the stairwell. She listened, concern knitting her brows, but trying not to show fear. Together, we walked back inside, double-checking the locks and pulling the blinds down completely. That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the block, the distant hum of cars, the occasional bark of a dog, the whisper of wind in the trees. But beneath those familiar noises was something else. A faint, rhythmic tapping at the window, soft enough to be dismissed as branches or rain, but persistent. I didn't dare look. By morning, the streetlights on Maple Drive were still dead, and the silence had deepened into a thick unease. I wanted to believe it was over for now, that the police patrols would keep the neighborhood safe at least until the blackout ended. But as I sipped my coffee, watching the gray dawn seep through the kitchen window, I knew this was just the beginning. The darkness wasn't a simple absence of light, it was a place where people stopped being themselves, where something in the neighborhood had shifted. And I was caught in the middle of it. The next evening, the air had a brittle edge that made me want to pull my jacket tighter around me. I left the apartment a little earlier than usual, hoping to beat the darkness or at least avoid the worst of it. Lucy was finally home, curled up on the couch with a book, but I still felt restless, as if the apartment itself was too quiet, too still. I took the long way around, walking several blocks out of my way just to stay on streets where the lamps still worked properly. The blackout on Maple Drive was still stubbornly unresolved, and the city crews seemed nowhere in sight. I passed the convenience store again. Its windows were dark, but I caught the faint reflection of movement inside. Maybe a cleaning crew, or someone closing up for the night, though nothing was posted on the door about hours or workers. The street was almost empty, except for the occasional car passing by. A few pedestrians shuffled quickly past, their heads down, eyes fixed on their phones or on the pavement. No one met my gaze. I felt the slow, familiar tightening in my chest, the feeling that eyes were watching me even when no one was there. I stopped to glance down Maple Drive. The street stretched out before me like a tunnel of shadows, the dead streetlights yawning like empty sockets. I thought of the man in the car, the one with the bat. I thought of the knocking at the door, the figure in the stairwell. Each memory felt like a sting in the back of my mind. As I turned the corner to head back toward the lit streets, I noticed a figure standing near the edge of the sidewalk, half hidden in the darkened doorway of an old townhouse. He was tall and broad, wearing a heavy coat that swallowed his frame. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and he didn't move as I approached. When I looked up, his eyes caught mine for a moment. They were sharp and cold, the kind of gaze that doesn't just see you but weighs you. I nodded briefly and kept walking, telling myself it was just a guy waiting for a ride or a friend. But the way he didn't blink, how his posture didn't relax, it felt deliberate, like he was marking his territory. Closer to home, I slowed again, glancing over my shoulder. The street behind me was empty, but the feeling of being followed crept in, subtle but unmistakable. My pace quickened. I passed a group of young men leaning against a parked van, their voices low but carrying a rough edge. I pretended not to notice them, but I caught one of them glance my way and smirk. The moment passed, but the unease lingered. When I finally stepped inside the apartment, the warmth hit me like a wave. Lucy looked up from her book, concern flickering in her eyes. I closed the door and double-checked the locks before exhaling. I told her about the man in the doorway, the group of guys, how the whole neighborhood felt like it was shrinking around me. She reached out and squeezed my hand, telling me to call her if anything felt off, that we'd get through this together. But that night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the building, every distant car, every whispered sound outside my window seemed amplified. I tried to drown it out with the television, but the static hiss between channels only made the silence feel thicker. Around midnight, I heard a soft tapping at the window again. Not like branches or rain, but precise fingertips lightly rapping the glass in a slow, deliberate pattern. My heart slammed against my ribs. I didn't look. Lucy stood beside me, murmuring something sleepy, and I shushed her, telling her it was probably just a cat or the wind. The tapping stopped. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, willing the night to end. The next morning, I found a note slipped under our apartment door. It was written on a scrap of notebook paper in jagged letters, "Stop watching." No signature, no indication of who had left it. The note's edges were crumpled, and a faint smear of something dark, dried mud, maybe stained the bottom corner. I showed Lucy, and we sat together in silence, neither of us sure what to do next. Calling the police again felt like admitting defeat, like inviting more attention rather than safety. Later that day, I scanned the neighborhood from the window. Maple Drive was still dark, the streetlights dead and powerless. A few residents had started putting up extra lighting, string lights on porches, lanterns by doors, but the uneven glow did little to calm the atmosphere. I noticed a man from the doorway again, this time standing closer to the convenience store. He wasn't alone. Another figure stood nearby, equally still, equally watchful. They didn't seem to acknowledge each other, but together they formed a silent blockade in the street. I considered leaving the apartment, going somewhere safer, but the thought of stepping back into the darkened streets felt impossible. Instead, I called Lucy at work and asked if she could leave early. I needed her here. That evening, she came home with groceries and a determined look in her eyes. We boarded up the lower windows with thick cardboard and secured extra locks on the doors. We set up the small motion sensor lights we'd bought for camping in the hallway and kept the hallway light on all night. Still, every sound unsettled me. The creak of floorboards, the rustle of leaves, the distant roar of cars. And somewhere in the dark, I knew someone was waiting. The escalation felt inevitable. The neighborhood was no longer just dimmed by power outages, it was cloaked in something far darker, the awareness that we were being watched, circled, tested. I told myself to stay calm, to keep my head down, to trust that the police patrols would increase, that the city would fix the lights soon. But the note under the door was a reminder that this wasn't some random trouble. Someone wanted to send a message. And as the blackout stretched on, every shadow deepened, every silence grew heavier, and I felt the walls closing in around me. For the first time since all this started, I locked the door with shaking fingers and kept the curtains closed tight. Because whatever was out there wasn't just lurking in the dark. It was waiting for me to slip up. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep my guard up. The days after the note arrived blurred together, each one dripping with the same suffocating unease. Lucy stayed home more, working remotely when she could, and I took to adjusting my routine, leaving before dawn, avoiding the streets after dark. But no matter how much I tried to keep the shadows at bay, they crept closer, folding into the ordinary moments until there was no real escape. One morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing insistently on the kitchen counter. I blinked the sleep from my eyes and reached for it, expecting a message from Lucy. Instead, it was a call from an unknown number. My heart thumped, hesitating before I answered. "Hello?" There was a pause on the other end. Then a voice, low and measured, cutting through the static. "You've been looking too hard," it said. "You should stop." I gripped the phone tighter, trying to steady my voice. "Who is this?" No response. The line went dead. I stared at the silent screen, cold dread pooling in my stomach. Was this some sick prank? A neighbor with too much time? Or had someone really been watching close enough to know what I'd seen, what I was doing? Lucy was already awake by the time I finally told her. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug, her face pale but resolute. "We can't ignore it anymore," she said quietly. "We need to do something." I wanted to agree, but the truth was, I had no idea where to start. That afternoon, I decided to walk down Maple Drive. Not the whole street, just a few blocks where the blackout was worst. It was a stupid idea, but I needed to see it for myself, to feel it again, even if it made my skin crawl. Lucy begged me not to, but I told her I'd be careful. The street was a tunnel of shadows, the dead streetlights stretching like broken sentinels into the distance. I kept my phone flashlight on, scanning the cracked pavement and the darkened doorways. The usual silence was thick, oppressive, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the cold wind. Halfway down the block, I noticed something odd. A pile of flattened cardboard boxes stacked against the side of an abandoned house. At first, I thought maybe someone had left them there for recycling, but the pile looked deliberate, almost like a makeshift wall. I stepped closer, and that's when I heard the breath. A sharp inhalation, close and ragged, coming from behind the boxes. I froze, heart hammering so loud I was sure it had to be heard. Slowly, I edged around the pile, hands raised and empty. "Hey," I said softly, trying to sound calm. "Is someone there?" A figure blinked up at me from the dark, a young man, maybe late teens, dirty clothes hanging off him. His eyes were wide and wild, darting between me and the street. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Didn't mean to scare you." He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. The smell of smoke and damp was sharp on his clothes. I realized then that this was no casual trespasser or local troublemaker. This kid was homeless, maybe run away, maybe trapped in some kind of spiral I couldn't begin to understand. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice softer now. He shook his head, biting his lip. "I just need a place to stay. Anywhere. I won't cause trouble." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to tell Lucy, to call a shelter, but another part just wanted to help, to offer a bit of kindness in the dark. "I can call someone for you," I said. "I know a shelter nearby." He looked at me, hope flickering for just a second before fading. "No shelters. They're full. And it's cold." The truth of the cold night hit me then, the empty streets, the dead lights, the way the neighborhood seemed to close in on itself. I offered him a warm jacket and told him I'd get him some food. Back in the apartment, Lucy was waiting with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She warmed up some soup while I made a call to a local outreach program. They said they'd send someone out to check on the kid within the hour. We sat in tense silence as the minutes ticked by, the boy huddled on the couch wrapped in the jacket. His hands trembled, and his eyes kept darting toward the windows, as if expecting something to appear in the darkness. Then the knocking came again. Soft, deliberate taps at the front door. I shot a look at Lucy, who was already standing, eyes wide. "Don't open it," she whispered. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of footsteps retreating into the night. We didn't speak for a long time after that. The boy told us his name was Micah and that he'd been living on the fringes of the neighborhood for weeks, avoiding the police and the people who had started showing up, people who weren't there for help. When the outreach worker finally arrived, Micah slipped away quietly, promising to come back if he could. We locked the door and drew the blinds tight, but the sense of vulnerability lingered like a stain. That night, I lay awake, listening to the sounds outside, the rustle of leaves, the distant car engines, the occasional call of a stray dog. Somewhere out there, I knew, were people who thought they owned the darkness, who used it to stalk and intimidate. But there were others like Micah, caught in the same shadows, struggling just to survive. The police increased their patrols the next day, citing a rise in reports of suspicious activity. The city crews finally arrived to fix the streetlights, and by evening, the blackouts on Maple Drive began to lift, one lamp at a time. For the first time in weeks, the street looked almost normal, familiar and safe under the glow of yellow light. But as I watched from my window, I realized that the real darkness wasn't something you could fix with a flick of a switch. It was the people. And some of them were still out there, waiting. The streetlights on Maple Drive buzzed and flickered awake one by one that evening, like reluctant soldiers returning to duty. After weeks of darkness, the sudden return of yellow light should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like the neighborhood was waking from a long, uneasy sleep, alert, but still wary. I stood by the window, watching the glow stretch across cracked pavement and the front steps of houses, while Lucy busied herself in the kitchen. For a moment, the familiar rhythm of home settled around me. The hum of the refrigerator, the muffled clink of dishes, the low murmur of Lucy's voice humming an old tune. The street outside was alive again, not empty or still like before, but it carried a new kind of tension, a charged quietness I couldn't shake. I thought maybe the worst was behind us. The repair crews had promised the lights would be back by dusk, and they had kept their word. The city trucks had come earlier that day, workers fussing over broken poles and wires, their flashlights bobbing across the dark for hours. I'd watched from the window as a few neighbors lingered outside, their faces tilted upward, hopeful or skeptical. But no one said much, as if the return of light was too fragile to celebrate out loud. Later, Lucy and I decided to take a short walk, just a quick circle around the block. The air was cold and sharp, with that slippery edge of early November that seemed to make every breath visible. The sidewalks were slick from an earlier rain, reflecting the streetlights like broken mirrors. I had my jacket zipped tight, hands shoved deep in my pockets, and the knot of anxiety settled stubbornly in my gut. As we stepped outside, the street felt different, less threatening, but not safe. The shadows had retreated, but the pressure hadn't. Every step stirred the faint, metallic scent of wet pavement and something else I couldn't place. It wasn't far off, but it was just out of reach, like a memory I couldn't quite summon. We walked slowly, sticking to the well-lit sidewalks. The convenience store was open again, its neon sign buzzing softly above the door. Inside, a clerk arranged candy bars behind the counter, glancing up as we passed. No sign of the men who'd haunted the block these past weeks. For now. We turned the corner at Elm Street, moving toward where the blackout had been worst. The streetlights there still flickered unevenly, some bulbs sputtering as if unsure they wanted to stay on. Lucy reached out and squeezed my arm. "Feels different, doesn't it?" she said quietly. "Yeah," I replied. "Like the neighborhood's holding its breath." We passed a few neighbors who nodded briefly, their faces tight with fatigue and something else, maybe suspicion, maybe relief. No one spoke about the note or the knocks or the men in the shadows. It was the kind of silence that held stories too heavy to share. As we neared the intersection with Maple, something caught my eye. Across the street, halfway down a driveway, a man stood alone under a street lamp. He was tall, with a bulky coat pulled tight against the chill, hands buried deep in his pockets. His posture was rigid, almost like a statue carved out of shadow and light. I stopped mid-step. The man turned slightly, and for a brief second, our eyes met. There was nothing familiar about him. No warmth, no hesitation. Just a cold, assessing gaze that felt like a test. Lucy noticed me pause and looked over my shoulder. I nodded, indicating the man. She frowned, her hand tightening on my arm. "Should we keep moving?" she whispered. Before I could answer, the man gave a slow nod, then stepped back into the deeper darkness beyond the reach of the street lamp. The amber light swallowed him up, and he vanished like a shadow slipping into a crack. We hurried on, the quiet between us thick and unspoken. Back inside the apartment, I locked the door and checked the deadbolt twice. Lucy pulled the blinds down tight, and we sat together on the couch, the weight of the evening pressing down like a storm cloud. I tried to tell myself the man was just another neighbor, maybe someone out for a late walk, or someone waiting for a ride. But the look in his eyes was something else. It was a warning. Later, as we settled in for the night, I noticed a small motion sensor light we'd installed by the front door had triggered twice in the last hour. Each time, the light flickered on, casting our short hallway in harsh white, only to reveal empty space when I rushed to the door. Lucy suggested it was the wind, or maybe a stray cat. But I wasn't convinced. Around midnight, the knocking started again. This time, it was slower, less urgent, but no less deliberate. Tap. Tap. Pause. Tap. Tap. The rhythm pressed against the door like the ticking of a clock counting down. I stayed silent, watching the door through the peephole. Outside, the porch light flickered with an unreliable buzz, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow flicker just beyond the glass. The knocking stopped. I exhaled slowly and sank back into the couch, the tension unspooling just enough to let me breathe. Lucy curled up beside me, and I felt the fragile edge of comfort in her presence. That night, sleep came in fits and starts. Every creak, every whisper of wind felt magnified. The new streetlights had brought the neighborhood back to life, but they hadn't scattered the unease lurking beneath the surface. It was like the darkness had leached into the people themselves, waiting, watching, patient. In the early hours, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was a text from Lucy. I locked the back door. "We're safe." I didn't reply. Instead, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the image of the man under the street lamp circling in my mind. The blackout was over, but the danger wasn't. And now it felt closer than ever. Story 6, The Silence Beneath Hollow Creek House. I had thought moving to a small town would quiet everything down. After a decade of city noise, cramped apartments, and neighbors who screamed more than they talked, I wanted calm. So when I found the rental on Maple Street, a modest two-bedroom house with a faded blue porch swing and a garden that someone clearly once cared about, I didn't hesitate. The first few days passed in a blur of unpacking, buying groceries, and unpacking again. The town was small enough that by the second afternoon, I knew the faces at the grocery store's checkout counter, the barista who made my morning coffee, and the elderly man who walked his dog past my window every evening. They all smiled, exchanged polite hellos, and soon, I had a rhythm that wasn't the chaos I'd escaped. On the third night, I noticed the streetlights outside my bedroom window flickered. It was a subtle thing, a brief stutter rather than a blackout. I chalked it up to old wiring. The house was built in the late 60s, and I'd already seen the peeling paint and dated fixtures. Still, it was enough to make the shadows in my room feel a little denser, the corners less forgiving. The next morning, while making coffee, I found the garden hose had been wrapped in a coil on the porch, but the nozzle was missing. I couldn't remember if I'd taken it off to water the plants or if someone else had been there. I lived alone. The door was locked. I didn't hear anything unusual overnight. I shrugged it off, telling myself I must have been half asleep when I last watered the flowers. Still, a vague unease settled in my chest. A week into living there, I started noticing more things. Small signs, easy to dismiss. A footprint in the garden mud, but no one around. A faint smell of cigarette smoke in the kitchen, even though I didn't smoke. The telltale crease on the porch swing's cushion suggested someone had sat there recently, though I rarely used it. I began double-checking locks, peering through curtains, and listening for sounds I couldn't place. One evening, after coming home from work, I found the mailbox lid slightly ajar. Inside, there was a plain white envelope with no return address. I hesitated before pulling it out. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, with a few words scrawled in messy handwriting. "You're not as alone as you think." My heart jumped. I looked up and down the street. The street was empty. No cars, no people. I locked the mailbox, glanced at my door, and wondered if I should call the police. But what could I say? That someone had left me a creepy note? Probably just a prank. I shoved the letter in my pocket and went inside, locking every door and window. I didn't sleep well that night. The following day, I told my neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, about the note. She was in her garden, trimming roses, her face weathered but kind. "Probably just some kids messing around," she said with a dismissive wave. "You're new here. Folks don't usually bother anyone." That reassured me enough to put the note away. Maybe it was nothing. But the signs kept coming. A broken flower pot on the porch one morning, shards scattered across the steps. A rock through the living room window. No damage beyond the glass, but the glass was cracked in a way that suggested force, not accident. No note this time. No message, just the damage. I reported the vandalism to the police, who took a report and told me to call if anything else happened. When I mentioned the note, the officer didn't seem interested. "Probably teenagers," he said. "If it's more serious, we'll know soon enough." I tried to keep my routine. Work, groceries, dinner, sleep. But the hours felt different. The silence stretched too long. The shadows seemed to creep closer. Every creak and groan of the old building was amplified in my mind. One night, around midnight, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. I froze. The porch light was out. The only illumination came from a street lamp down the block, weak and yellow. I pressed my back against the door, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. Then, a faint scratching sound like fingernails against wood. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and inched toward the door. The porch was empty. No footprints, no signs of someone having been there moments before. No one in the street. My breath came fast, and I sat down, knife still in hand, waiting for dawn. The next morning, I found another letter slipped under the front door. This one was typed on a computer. "I'm closer than you think." I called the police again, but no one came. I told myself to be rational. Someone was trying to scare me. Maybe a stalker, or just a prankster who had found out I was alone. My phone rang that afternoon. No caller ID. I didn't answer. When I checked the missed calls, there were 3 in a row. I sat down, hands trembling. I called back once, but it went straight to voicemail. That night, I installed a security camera on the porch. It was the best I could do. I told myself it was enough, that I was doing something, but the tension didn't lift. 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of something heavy hitting the front door. Again and again. I sat up, the knife in my hand. The storm outside had knocked branches down, I told myself. Then I checked the camera footage. There was a man standing on the porch, the hood of a dark sweatshirt pulled over his head. He threw a brick at the door, then tried the handle. After a few moments, he walked away. I called the police again, and this time they sent an officer. He took another report, promised to increase patrols in the area. I felt a flicker of relief. For a night, the house was quiet. No footsteps, no notes. The street lamp worked. The porch light stayed on. But in the morning, when I opened the door, the garden hose nozzle was back on the porch, coiled neatly, but wet. I didn't remember watering the garden the night before. And I was sure I had locked every door. I closed the door slowly and locked it behind me, glancing nervously at the empty street. The feeling that I wasn't alone had become impossible to ignore. After weeks of small, creeping threats, the man on the porch had escalated the situation from eerie to dangerous. But he hadn't broken in. Not yet. I didn't know what he wanted. I didn't know if he was watching me now, just around the corner, or farther away, waiting. All I knew was that my quiet town had turned into a cage. And the cage was closing. That morning, after finding the wet garden hose nozzle on the porch, I didn't leave the house for the first time in days. The air felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. I sat on the edge of the couch, phone in hand, wrestling with whether I should call the police again or hire a locksmith to change the locks. Neither option felt like a guaranteed solution. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. I froze. My heart hammered, and the knot in my stomach tightened. It was a light, hesitant knock, 3 taps, and then silence. I didn't recognize the rhythm. It wasn't the usual polite knock of a neighbor or delivery person. I didn't want to look through the peephole. Instead, I swallowed hard and called out, "Who's there?" No answer. The silence stretched long enough that I thought maybe whoever it was had moved on. But then, from somewhere on the porch, a faint rustling sound. I crept to the door and looked down. On the welcome mat sat a small, pale envelope, with no writing or markings on it. I slid the door open just enough to pick it up and slammed it shut again. Back inside, I tore it open and found a single photograph. It was a picture of my house, taken from the street, I guessed during the cloudy night a few nights ago when the man had thrown the brick. The porch light was dim, the sidewalk slick with rain. But what made my stomach drop was the figure standing just out of frame on the left, a shadow barely visible in the dark, but unmistakably human. I flipped the photo over. Nothing. No message, no signature. I sat down at the kitchen table, trying to steady my breathing. The cold weight of the photo pressed against my palm. Someone had been watching me, had taken pictures, had gotten close enough to leave things at my door without me seeing. The doorbell rang then, unexpectedly loud and insistent. I glanced at the clock. It was barely 2 in the afternoon. Who would come by now? I didn't even know anyone well enough to expect an unannounced visit. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it. But the ringing didn't stop. It was sharp and urgent, cutting through the silence of the house. I moved cautiously to the door and peered through the frosted glass beside it. Standing on the porch was a man, mid-30s, with unkempt dark hair and a rough beard. He wore a stained jacket and jeans. His eyes met mine through the glass, and I felt a sudden surge of adrenaline. He smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile that felt like a warning. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said through the door. "I'm looking for a place to stay, just for a night." My car broke down a few miles back. I shook my head, heart racing. My voice felt small and tight. No, sorry. I can't help. Look, I'm not here to cause trouble, he said, stepping back from the door. I just need somewhere warm. I've been on the road for days. I wanted to believe him, to see a person in need. But after everything, after the notes and the vandalism and the man on the porch, my caution won out. I really can't, I said firmly. Good luck. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked down the steps. I shut the door and locked it, pressing my back against it as if that would keep him out. I spent the rest of the afternoon pacing. My mind ran through a fog of worst-case scenarios. Was he connected to the man on the porch? Had he been watching me too? Or was this a coincidence, just someone unlucky enough to be passing by? For dinner, I ordered takeout rather than risk going outside again. The delivery driver was polite, but the quick glance he gave me when I opened the door reminded me how easily fear can make someone seem suspicious. That night, I checked the security footage obsessively, but aside from the usual flickering street lamp, there was nothing unusual on the camera. No one returning. No one lurking. I locked every door and window, but I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the house made me jump. The shadows seemed longer than the night before. The next day, I noticed the porch swing had shifted. It was no longer centered. Instead, it leaned slightly to one side. My first thought was that the man must have been back during the night. But nothing else was disturbed. No footprints, no discarded cigarette butts, nothing. When I went outside to straighten the swing, a neighbor's voice stopped me. "Morning," said Mrs. Callahan, stepping out from her rose bushes, wiping dirt off her hands. "You look like you didn't sleep." I didn't, I admitted. Someone was here again last night. She sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "I'm sorry you're going through this. Sometimes people get fixated. It's not common, but it happens. Do you think it'll stop?" I asked, desperate. She shook her head. "It usually doesn't until the person's caught or decides to move on. But if it gets worse, don't hesitate to call the sheriff again. And maybe consider staying somewhere else for a while." Her suggestion echoed in my mind as I went back inside. Later that afternoon, I found a new note taped to my mailbox. This one was different. It was typed, like the last, but the words were simple and direct. "Stop looking." I crumpled the paper in my fist so hard my knuckles went white. The message was clear, but what terrified me most was that whoever was doing this knew precisely how much I was paying attention, how closely I was watching. By evening, I had made a decision. I packed a bag with essentials and called a friend from the city, asking if I could stay with her for a few days. She didn't hesitate to say yes. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every noise felt like footsteps. Every shadow was a person just out of sight. When dawn came, I locked the house, turned off the lights, and left the key with Mrs. Callahan, explaining I needed to be elsewhere for a bit. As I drove away, I looked back at the house on Maple Street. The porch swing hung still in the faint morning light, the garden hose coiled neatly on the porch. For a moment, it looked peaceful, like a place I could come home to. But I knew better. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The man on the porch hadn't broken in, but he'd already breached every boundary I tried to set. The notes, the photos, the visits, they weren't just random acts. They were warnings. Signals that I was being watched, tracked, and controlled. For now, my friend's apartment in the city was a sanctuary. A place where I could breathe without glancing over my shoulder every 5 minutes. But the cage wasn't gone. It was just waiting for me to come back. The city felt like a different world after Maple Street. Traffic roared non-stop, people brushed past me like rushing rivers, and the neon glow of storefronts replaced the dull amber of street lamps. For a few days, I almost believed I could forget what was waiting for me back home. But the quiet wouldn't let me rest. My friend's apartment was cramped, her walls thin, and every unfamiliar sound made me flinch. I stayed awake more nights than I slept, waiting for some sign, some warning. On the third morning, I had just settled with a cup of coffee on her worn sofa when my phone buzzed. It was a message, no number, just a text. "You left your door open." My breath caught. I stared at the screen, fingers trembling. The message was vague, but it hit a nerve. I hadn't told anyone where I was staying, and I hadn't left anything unsecured, at least not here. It was the kind of message that felt like a handshake from a ghost, though I knew better than to believe in ghosts. Someone was still watching me. I called Mrs. Callahan immediately, using the landline at my friend's place. The old woman answered after 2 rings, and I wasted no time explaining the message. "Sweetheart, I'm worried," Mrs. Callahan said softly. "I haven't been by your house since you left, but if you want, I can check on it today." I hesitated. The thought of returning felt like stepping back into a trap, but I also couldn't leave the house like this, unwatched, exposed. "Would you? Please." She promised to keep me updated. I hung up, heart pounding, and tried to focus on something else, work emails, the news, anything. But my mind was a spiral of worst-case scenarios. What if the message meant someone had slipped inside? What if they were waiting for me to come back? That afternoon, Mrs. Callahan called. I stopped by. "Your porch light's off, which is odd." The door was locked, and everything seemed in place. But I noticed something. There's a fresh set of footprints in the mud by the garden. Fresh. Like last night? Must be. The ground's been dry for days until this morning. And there are cigarette butts, more than usual, scattered around the side of your house. I swallowed hard, imagining the man in the stained jacket again, the one who'd asked for a place to stay. Was he back? Had he been there while I was gone? Was this just someone emboldened by my absence? "I'm coming back tomorrow," I told Mrs. Callahan. "I can't keep running." She hesitated, then said quietly, "Be careful. And if you want, I'll stay with you for the first night. Just until you feel safe." That night, I barely slept. The city's sounds seeped through the window, sirens, distant conversations, the hum of late traffic, but none of that scared me. It was the thought of returning to the quiet danger on Maple Street that made the darkness feel suffocating. The next morning, I packed a small bag again, this time with more things: pepper spray, a flashlight, an extra phone charger. I felt ridiculous carrying it all, but it was a small comfort, a semblance of control. Mrs. Callahan met me at the bus stop 2 blocks from my house. Her presence was a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in this. When we reached the house, the first thing I noticed was the porch light. It was still off. The garden hose lay coiled, dry now, but the welcome mat was strangely askew. I bent down to straighten it and caught a glimpse of something hot under the edge of the mat, a small scrap of paper, folded twice. I picked it up carefully, heart pounding. Written in pencil, shaky but deliberate, were 2 words: "Watch out." Mrs. Callahan's eyes narrowed. "This is serious now." I nodded. "They're getting bolder." We stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of damp wood and dust, but otherwise nothing seemed disturbed. No signs of forced entry, no broken glass. Still, every shadow felt thicker, every creak sharper. Mrs. Callahan insisted she stay for the night. We set up the cot in the living room, arranged chairs near the doors and windows, and double-checked every lock. I plugged in the security camera, watching the small screen flicker to life. As evening settled, I tried to talk myself into normalcy. Maybe it's just some local troublemakers, I said, forcing a laugh. Kids are drunks trying to scare me off. Mrs. Callahan shook her head. This isn't random. Someone's fixated. It's personal. The house seemed to hold its breath with us. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. The street lamp flickered again, casting uneven pools of light on the porch. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps. Slow. Measured. Coming from the back of the house. I froze, listening. The steps paused near the kitchen window. Then a light tapping, 3 soft knocks. Mrs. Callahan, asleep beside me, stirred but didn't wake. I strained to hear more, but after a moment, the footsteps faded into the night. I didn't dare get up. Instead, I reached for the phone and dialed 911. The operator assured me officers would be dispatched to patrol the area more frequently. The morning came with a fragile calm. The porch light was finally on, and the welcome mat was back in place. The garden hose nozzle was gone again, though the hose remained coiled neatly. I opened the front door cautiously, stepping outside with Mrs. Callahan close behind me. On the porch, under a solitary beam of light, lay a single key. It was old-fashioned, brass, not one I recognized. No note or indication of who it belonged to. My stomach twisted. A key meant access either promising or threatening. Mrs. Callahan picked it up, turning it over in her palm. This has to be a message. I nodded, feeling the weight of it settle deep in my bones. The cage was tightening. The quiet town was no longer a refuge, it was a trap with walls closing in. And whoever was sending these signs was saying one thing loud and clear: they were still here. Watching. Waiting. For now, I wasn't alone. But the sense of being hunted had only grown sharper. I locked the door behind me, the key heavy in my hand, and wondered how long I could keep running without breaking. The morning light filtered weakly through the curtains, casting pale stripes across the floor. I woke stiff, the air in the room stale and cool, like it had been trapped there for hours. Mrs. Callahan was already up, moving quietly in the kitchen, her footsteps soft against the linoleum. I stared at the ceiling, heart still thudding from the night's eerie visits. The key was on the kitchen table, polished brass glinting faintly in the morning light. I reached for it instinctively, turning it over in my fingers. A key has a way of promising things: access, control, safety, none of which I felt. I wondered if it meant my tormentor had found another way in, or if it was a dare, a taunt, something worse. We sat down to breakfast in tense silence. Mrs. Callahan broke it first. "That key," she said, "it looks old. Like it had opened a door or gate from around here, maybe decades ago." She paused. "Do you have any old locks on the property? A side door, a shed, maybe?" I shook my head. "Not that I know of. The only doors are the front and back, plus the basement door. But everything's been replaced or rekeyed recently. I never even used the basement." She nodded, eyes narrowing. "Still, it's a message. Whoever it is wants you to know they have access. Or at least, they want you to think that." I felt a cold knot settle deeper in my stomach. The knowledge that someone might have a key to my house, my refuge, was unbearable. I pushed the thought away and tried to focus on the day ahead. We agreed Mrs. Callahan would stay longer, at least another night. The idea of being alone in the house again was suffocating. I called a locksmith to change all the locks first thing tomorrow, but in the meantime, I triple-checked every bolt and latch. The morning passed in a blur. I worked on small tasks, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy, watering the plants, wiping down counters, even making a grocery list. But every so often, I caught myself flinching at a noise or looking toward the door with suspicion. Mrs. Callahan had a comforting presence, but even she seemed weighed down by the situation. We spoke little, sharing a quiet understanding that the house no longer felt like home. Late that afternoon, the sky darkened with gathering clouds. The wind picked up, rattling the window panes and sending dry leaves skittering across the porch. The street lamp outside flickered uncertainly, casting brief shadows that darted across the garden. I was standing by the window, staring out at the empty street, when I noticed something odd. A figure, slim, hunched slightly, stood at the end of the block, backlit by the glow of a distant traffic light. He was wearing a dark jacket, hood up, and seemed to be watching the house. My breath caught. The figure held a small object in his hand, though I couldn't tell what it was. Then, slowly, he turned and disappeared around the corner. "Did you see that?" I asked Mrs. Callahan, voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer immediately. Then, she said, "Yes. And I don't like it." I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling, and checked the security camera feed. The porch camera showed nothing unusual, just the empty steps, the coiled garden hose, the swing hanging still in the breeze. But the street was out of its view. The feeling of vulnerability settled over me again, heavier this time. The man had been close enough to watch, unseen but near. Hours later, as dusk deepened, I locked the kitchen door leading to the backyard and drew the curtains tight. Mrs. Callahan sat beside me, knitting quietly. The television hummed softly, but I wasn't really watching. Then the phone rang. No caller ID. I hesitated, staring at the screen. The knot in my chest tightened until it was nearly unbearable. I let it ring out. A moment later, the doorbell rang. 3 quick, sharp rings. I froze. Mrs. Callahan's knuckles whitened on her knitting needles, but she stayed calm. "Don't open it," she said. "We don't know who it is." The ringing stopped, replaced by silence. For a long minute, nothing stirred. Then, a soft scratching sound like fingernails scraping wood started at the front door. I pressed my ear to the door, breath shallow. The sound grew louder for a moment, then faded. We stayed glued to the doorway for what felt like hours, waiting for any sign of movement outside. But there was nothing. I locked the door and slid the deadbolt into place, then checked every other lock in the house. Everything was secure. Eventually, Mrs. Callahan suggested we try to sleep. I didn't argue. That night, I kept my phone in my hand, flashlight and pepper spray within reach. Every noise made me jump, every shadow seemed to twitch. Close to dawn, I heard a faint tapping at the back window, the kitchen window, the one Mrs. Callahan and I had locked earlier. I lay still, heart hammering, willing myself not to move. After a few moments, the tapping stopped. In the morning, we went outside to inspect the yard. The garden hose was missing its nozzle again, and the coil lay half unraveled on the porch. Under the porch swing, I noticed fresh footprints in the mud, small, as if the person had crouched or knelt there. No cigarette butts this time. No note. But on the doorstep, taped to the welcome mat, was another scrap of paper. This one said only one word, written in hurried, jagged handwriting: soon. The message carried a weight that pressed down on me like a physical thing. Soon. What did it mean? Soon what? A break-in? An attack? Or something I hadn't imagined yet? Mrs. Callahan looked at the note, then at me. "It's getting worse," she said quietly. I nodded, swallowing hard. "I'm changing the locks tomorrow without fail. And maybe Maybe I should consider staying somewhere else again. She shook her head firmly. No. You have to face this. You can't let them win by running every time. Her words were meant to steady me, but instead, they felt like a challenge. I wasn't sure I was ready to meet it. That afternoon, I called the locksmith and scheduled an appointment for early morning. Then I sat by the window, watching the street, waiting for the next move. The hours passed slowly. The sun dipped low, and the streetlights flickered on, one by one. As night fell, I felt a strange mix of dread and exhaustion. The cage was closing tighter, and the noose was pulling at my throat. But for now, no one came to the door. No footsteps echoed on the porch. The silence held for a moment. And in that brief respite, I dared to breathe. Morning came sluggishly, the sky a dull, unending gray that blurred the edges of the neighborhood. I woke to the cold draft slipping through an old window latch I hadn't noticed before, near the basement. The wind pushed at it, rattling faintly, a soft, relentless tapping that sounded like fingernails at a door. I sat up on the couch, wrapping my arms around myself, heart thudding with exhaustion and unease. Mrs. Callahan was already awake, her knitting needles clicking quietly from the armchair. The locksmith wasn't due until mid-morning, but I knew the day would stretch long before then, filled with waiting and watching. I kept the key from the porch in my pocket, a sharp weight that reminded me how little control I had. I made coffee, hands trembling as I poured the hot liquid. The house was too quiet. Even the usual creaks felt muted. I found myself peering out the kitchen window every few minutes, scanning the street past the sagging mailbox and the empty swing. Nothing moved except a few dry leaves skittering across cracked pavement. Mrs. Callahan shuffled into the kitchen, her face tired but steady. "You got to keep yourself busy," she said softly, setting down a small plate of toast. "Waiting's the worst part." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I know." We ate in silence, the scent of coffee mingling with the faint, familiar smell of wet earth from the garden. The hose lay coiled on the porch again, missing its nozzle, like a quiet reminder that someone had been here. Around 10, the phone rang. No caller ID. My fingers hovered, then I let it ring out. I wasn't ready to hear a voice that might be waiting on the other end. The silence after the ringing felt heavier than before. Mrs. Callahan glanced at me, eyes sharp. She was as keyed up as I was. The locksmith arrived shortly after, a middle-aged man with a grease-stained cap and a toolbox perched awkwardly in one hand. He greeted us politely and didn't ask many questions. He moved methodically, changing locks, rekeying doors and windows, muttering about old hardware and outdated security. I watched his every move, the sound of tumblers clicking open and shut echoing louder than it should in the quiet house. When he finished, he handed me the new keys, a small bundle of cold metal that felt like a thin shield against the unknown. "Better safe than sorry," he said, packing up his tools. "You'll want to keep these close." After he left, I checked and rechecked every lock, testing the doors and windows until my fingers were numb. The basement door, which I half ignored until then, was now locked tight, and I set a heavy chair against it just to be sure. Mrs. Callahan stayed through the afternoon, knitting and humming softly as if trying to thread calm into the air. I decided to clean, hoping that making the house less cluttered would make it feel less like a trap. As I wiped down the counters and straightened cushions, I kept noticing small things out of place: an empty beer can behind the porch bush, a cigarette butt crushed near the back steps, muddy footprints by the side gate. I took photos on my phone, a record for the police or whoever might need it. The evidence was fragmentary, but the pattern was clear. Someone had been here again, quietly, close enough to touch the house. It wasn't just vandalism or random trouble, it was stalking, and the stalker was patient, careful. That evening, after Mrs. Callahan left, I sat near the window holding my pepper spray, watching the street under the flickering street lamp. The garden hose lay where it always did, coiled but missing its nozzle. The swing hummed still, like a silent witness. Around 9, the porch light abruptly went out. I blinked, heart skipping, then reached for the flashlight. The darkness pressed in heavily around the edges of the house. Suddenly, I heard it, footsteps. Slow, measured, deliberate, on the gravel driveway. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped just beyond the yard, near the edge of the street. I caught a faint smell, cigarette smoke, sour and sharp. A shadow detached itself from the dim light of a neighbor's porch, a dark shape moving just out of the camera's view. I couldn't make out a face, but the figure paused, turned, and looked directly at my window. I shut the curtains quickly, heart hammering. The footsteps retreated slowly, fading into the night. For a long time, I sat frozen, the flashlight beam trembling in my hands. Later, when I felt steady enough to move, I checked the security footage. The camera had caught nothing beyond the faint outline of the porch and the garden hose. The street was out of view again. I called the police, voice tight and urgent, explaining the footsteps, the light going out, the figure watching me. The dispatcher said they would send a patrol, but it might be a while. I asked for extra checks near the street lamp. I locked all the doors and windows again, then sat in the dark living room, flashlight and pepper spray close by, waiting for the night to end. Hours passed with nothing but the occasional creak from the old house and the steady hum of distant traffic. At dawn, I stepped outside cautiously, finding the garden hose nozzle sitting on the porch step. It was wet, again. Fresh footprints, some small, some larger, marred the muddy ground around the porch swing. But something was different this time. On the welcome mat, a new note, folded carefully. I unfolded it with trembling fingers. It read, "Tomorrow." No signature, no other markings. I stood there, the note heavy in my hand, sun rising behind the dull clouds. Tomorrow. What would happen tomorrow? I didn't know. But it was clear the person watching me wasn't just toying with me anymore. The game was escalating, and the rules were shifting. Mrs. Callahan arrived a few minutes later, and when I showed her the note, her eyes darkened. "We need to call the sheriff again," she said, voice low. I nodded, already dialing. For now, I had new locks and a message pinned to my porch. Tomorrow meant something was coming. And I wasn't ready.